morning, all. This is Megan Hemming coming to you from my kitchen right here in Rockland, California. And you're attending the Emergency Preparedness Summit for Special Districts. And I just wanted to thank you all for making time to address and learn more about this important topic. I wanted to thank USC and the Executive Education Forum for their participation and their help in putting together all the panelists and speakers and content for this two-day summit. I think it's going to be very valuable for everyone in attendance. I wanted to thank the Special District Risk Management Authority. SDRMA is an important partner of CSDA, and they're offering credit incentive points for their members that are in attendance today. So we thank them very much for their participation and encouraging their members to attend the Emergency Preparedness Summit. Again, thanks to USC and also Southern California Edison. Southern California Edison has been such an important partner for CSDA in bringing this education to our members and their support of special districts throughout the state. So we really appreciate that and their help in bringing this to especially our members at no cost and allowing this to be a virtual event so that more people could attend from throughout this state. Although I do know we would like to all be together. This is a terrific way for us to access this education and all of the information and speakers today. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the CSDA board members in attendance today. Pete Campa, Steve Perez, and also Kim Sini are attending from the CSDA board today, and we're very appreciative of that. I know we did have one question about accessing the agenda, and we showed the QR code that you're able to get with your phone. You're also able to access the agenda on the CSDA website using the registration link that you used for this event. So feel free to use that as well. And again, thank you to everyone for your participation. And we're looking forward to a wonderful 2 days of information and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Zerunyan. I am a professor at the University of Southern California, Sol Price School of Public Policy. I also direct our Executive Education Forum for elected and appointed leaders in California and other states. As well as our ROTC programs, our military reserve officer training programs at the university. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to our virtual classroom. And I hope that we will see many of you in our USC beautiful classrooms someday as we do a number of events throughout the year on policy and public administration that I'm sure your members would be interested in attending. We look forward to that in future days, hopefully post-COVID. I hope you enjoy the program. We designed it with you in mind. We're very thankful to the California Special District Association, as Megan mentioned, to your board members, as well as Southern California Edison, who actually thought that this could be a good program for us to organize at USC and deliver it over 2 Fridays. So this Friday is the first, second Friday will be next Friday. And I hope that you will all attend. If you attend both programs, you will get a USC certificate for attendance at this very, very special event. With that, I think I'm prepared to go right into our first panel. I actually have the distinct pleasure of moderating it. This panel is, of course, near and dear to my heart. They are very special people to me. They are part of my Trojan family, as we say, at USC in various different capacities. First and foremost, to kind of set the stage for all of you, USC is a city of its own. While our campus may not be one of the largest university campuses across the United States, it's still a sizable property where about 100,000 people during the day come in and out. So we're like a city of 100,000 people on any given day with various public administration needs, public safety, emergency management, etc. We also are in the middle of one of the largest cities in the United States. We are downtown Los Angeles, And we're in the commercial hub, so to speak, of LA, as LA has grown and has come all the way to USC, especially the downtown area, through the Figueroa corridor. So we also interact with the city of LA, a city of about 4 million people, on a regular basis. So today, we've invited Dr. Drake. JD is actually the assistant chief of Los Angeles Fire Department. But more importantly, JD is very special to me because I gave him hell for about 4 years as he was my doctoral student at USC, matriculating in our Doctor of Public Policy and Planning degree. And probably a lot of heartburns as he was writing his dissertation. But he did it with flying colors, and he accepted all of my quirkiness in pushing him to the limit. And he of course, now has the title of Dr. Drake. So I'm very, very pleased to have him here with us. Thank you, JD, for being here. JT, on the other hand, John Thomas, is a dear friend of mine, and he is in charge of my safety as I walk every day on that campus. He's our public safety chief. DPS, Department of Public Safety, as it's known at the USC, is a very active and vibrant department that JT heads up with great care, passion, compassion, as he is actually from the community himself. He grew up right next door to USC. And he went to that other school. I never understood why, but never mind. We're not going to get into that right now. But regardless, he does have a degree from USC as well, and in our Executive Master in Leadership program. So welcome, JT, as well. Last but not least, Stephen. Stephen is also special as he at USC is in charge of course, fire safety and emergency management. And Steve has amazing talents. He has taught in my executive education program as a magician, believe it or not, as we sometimes are very creative in teaching leadership, and we use various forms of teaching leadership. And Bob Denhart, one of my colleagues, said, you know, Steve does magic, and I think there is a direct correlation with magic and leadership. So we'll invite you one of these days to one of these programs, and Steve will do a bunch of his magic. But Steve, thank you for being here as well. Gentlemen, I am going to kind of turn to you, and maybe let's start with JT, because you're in charge generally of our public safety at USC, and kind of set the stage for us, JT, about your responsibility, how you interact with JD and the city of Los Angeles, and what is your, generally speaking, response to this emergency management issue, which obviously involves a lot of planning.
Well, thank you, Frank, for the generous introduction and the stab at my other alma mater, UCLA. I will say the name, but you know, you're right. USC is a city into itself. Keep in mind, USC is the largest private employer in the city of Los Angeles, which is pretty significant. In addition to that, on any given day, we could have over 100,000 people in our community, students, faculty, and staff. So for me, in charge of the Department of Public Safety, which is one of the largest campus departments in the nation, we have approximately 300 officers. Approximately 100 of those are armed and sworn officers, and then the remaining 200 or so are unarmed, security guard level. So we have our hands full 24/7. We're 24/7, 365 days a year, and we cannot keep that campus environment safe without the partnerships that we have with our other first responders, Los Angeles Fire Department. We work very closely with LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department. We have a memorandum of agreement with them that allows for us to patrol in the neighborhoods. So in order for us to effectively ensure the safety of the vast number of people that are coming onto the USC campus and that are living in the surrounding community, we have to have good partnerships. And one of the things that we do, I think that's important, where we're able to forge those relationships in a non-crisis at non-crisis times. Every single USC football game, we have a unified command post. And that's 6 or 7 times a year. And in that unified command post, there's representation from the fire department, LAPD, Department of Homeland Security, USC Emergency Management and Planning. So there's representation from about 20 agencies. And we handle the security, not just for the game itself. The game itself is the smallest piece, but all of the moving parts that occur with tailgating and all of those things. So we have an opportunity 6 to 7 times a year to actually get together and actually not only develop a strategy for keeping that day safe, but we also forge some great relationships that help us out throughout the year.
Steve, to what JT said, let's go to your responsibility. I mean, part of your responsibility, of course, public safety, but you have fire and other concerns as well. So talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to go to JD to talk about the planning aspect of this, because he's intimately familiar with that side of it. But let's start first with you, Steve.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Appreciate it. When it comes to, as JT mentioned, we have the games, of course, where we work together. But throughout the year, training and exercising is a big part of our program. And we do a lot of training and exercises internally with our internal departments. We have our own first responders. We have our own CERT program, which is a campus emergency response team made up of volunteer staff and faculty that go through a formal FEMA training on emergency response. But then we also do several drills a year with Los Angeles Fire Department and LAPD and other agencies. As a matter of fact, a minimum once a year, we do active shooter exercises. And this is another opportunity where we get to practice the unified command approach, build the relationships, especially when it comes to crisis communications, having all of our public information officers meet each other, exchange business cards well before the real emergencies occur, and then build the trust that's necessary so that when you actually have a crisis, you immediately come together, you trust each other, you know exactly what you need to do, and you interact well together. So that's a common practice. We have an annual calendar of exercises and training. And because we have our University Park campus and our health sciences campus, there's also the unique needs around the hospitals and the medical setting. So we also ensure that our medical enterprise is involved with these trainings and exercises as well, because of the unique needs around that. And in addition to that, we also, as I mentioned, we have these specialized teams. We do a lot of tabletop exercises. And during the pandemic, because we're not able to get together physically, we've done, we're talking several times a week, we're doing tabletop exercises to align our objectives and to ensure that we're all on the same page, which is most critical in emergency response.
JD, you have a very unique role in the sense that you've attended this university as a doctoral student, and frankly, your doctoral thesis and dissertation ultimately was about planning, how to restructure a fire department to plan well for these type of collaborations. As one of the topics I teach, as you know, is collaboration and the importance of collaborative governance. Special districts are by law collaborative organizations that actually collaborate with a lot of our cities. Me as a council member, mayor in my city, I collaborate with several special districts, whether it's a library district, whether it's a water district, whether it's a fire district, whether it's a school district, whether it's a sewer district. It's like a number of districts. So let's get to you and first talk more about what kind of work goes into planning, strategizing this relationship, and how much value does that have to your agency?
From a broad perspective, you're absolutely right. We've made the mistake in years past of not understanding the value of collaboration, of inclusivity and participation. In fact, we oftentimes felt we were the big kid on the block, so we would act unilaterally. And it's not the most effective way is to be in a silo. We understand the value of our partners. And that was what my dissertation was a lot about. And in that change, it coincides with the changes in public administration, where we used to be autocratic, linear, hierarchical, top down. Now we've learned the value of that participative, inclusive, and collaborative process. And the reason is it makes us better. So we develop these things through this process in a unified command approach, as Chief Thomas mentioned. And what we do is we develop management objectives and control objectives. So we bring organization to incidents, accountability for responsibility, delegation, transfer of command within and out of the unified command system, where we're operating in a way that is going to facilitate both of our missions, which is ultimately to provide exceptional public safety and emergency services. That's our goal. And we can't do that if we aren't co-located in a command post. And as Steve and John said, we do this frequently at USC games. We've had exercises in the past on bomb threats back in 2013. So we also we have the ability, where warranted, to bring in federal, state, and local partners through mutual aid, automatic aid system, as well as contractual services that are offered depending on the magnitude of the incident and what is warranted to bring in the appropriate players. So we have learned that there's tremendous value in this teamwork approach, because that diversity of opinion is what helps us make the informed decisions.
JT, let me come back to you. I know this topic particularly is near and dear to your heart because you come from this community. USC sits smack in the middle of a community that at times is challenged with various social issues. Talk a little bit about some of the things that we do at USC and your outreach, so to speak. You've given me several examples, for example, in apartment buildings where gang issues were there, and how we reached out and how we actually got together with the community, how we engage, in other words, our stakeholders outside of USC.
Yeah, that's a very important piece, because of all the relationships that we develop within our first responder network, we also cannot forget about the communities that we serve, the surrounding community. And yes, the surrounding community around USC is a very challenge. Actually, both campuses, the health science campus, which is in East Los Angeles, and then the UPC campus, which is in South Los Angeles. So you're very, very challenged communities. And some of the things that we do as a department, because I do believe that, when you wear, the uniform and you're out and as visible as officers are, you are the most visible presence and ambassadors for your agency. So it's important to me and to the university that our officers build those relationships. And some of the things that we do is we look at, where are the needs in the community, and use those needs as avenues to push forward the shared responsibility of public safety. For instance, we have a cadet post, a youth cadet post, or what most people know as an Explorer program, that we pull together youth from the community, and we provide them an opportunity to go through some basic training for teenagers that allows for them to be well informed regarding safety protocols. They volunteer for football games, but they're members of the community. So that's an avenue by which, one, we can provide access to some of the resources that USC provides as far as educational tracking toward college. That's a great program, and we've got about 50 some odd kids in that from the surrounding neighborhood. The other thing is we look for the opportunities to address crime and quality of life issues. You mentioned working with the many apartment owners that surround USC, working with them to alleviate blight. working with them to effectively evict individuals that we know that are involved in criminal activities in collaboration with the city attorney's office and LAPD. So I look at it from the standpoint of all of it works towards making for a safer community. And it goes back to something that Dr. Drake said and Steve mentioned, is the importance of, building those relationships. And you can't build the relationships in the middle of a crisis. If the only time that our community members interact with my officers is when there's a crisis, that's not a relationship. That's not gonna pay dividends in the end in keeping that community safe. So I think we do a good job working in collaboration with our first responder partners, and they also assist us in building those relationships with the community around us. Because again, safety, emergency planning, being able to respond effectively in a crisis is only going to happen if there's trust and there's already established relationships with the first responder network.
Steve, how does your shop interact with the surrounding community, and how are you engaging the surrounding communities, plural, our health science as well as us, as JT is correct, they both sit in relatively challenged communities, and our interaction is a very, very important factor.
Yeah, one of the programs that we've done in the past is to provide our training out in the community, particularly the CERT program, where we've invited people from the community to learn and actually take the full course. We provide all the supplies and the equipment. We work around their schedules. And through that training, then we're building leaders that in a time of a crisis, especially if we had a major crisis like an earthquake or something, that we know that we have people in the community that are going to be more resilient and help the community. And we're going to help the community the best that we can, but to also have that connection too. We even have some people in the community that are amateur radio operators that are part of our amateur radio team, so they could communicate with us and we could connect and understand what the needs are in a crisis.
Thank you. JD, the emergency response planning that LA City does, how do you guys interact with the USC'S of the world? Because we're not alone. I mean, there's other organizations that are sizable and that can have at any given moment thousands of people within their property, so to speak. How does LA Fire interact with all types of organizations like that for emergency response planning?
Great question. And I want to preface that by saying that depending on the magnitude of the incident, we also have partners on a federal, state, and local level, but we start off locally typically. And our planning process, I love a quote by former President Eisenhower where he said, "Plans are worthless. Planning is indispensable." And I think everybody understands that this has got to be an iterative process. Although you still have to start off, as John Thomas would say, by forging those relationships. And so what we do is with these relationships, we have what we call a proactive leadership, where we develop event action plans. And an event action plan is a comprehensive list through a partnership with our law enforcement agencies and our other public safety providers, specifically USC, where we plan things out based on what we think could happen. So we call them event action plans. For example, a USC football game. And we have all these forms that we use with organization charts, the incident command system, where our hospitals are, our medical capabilities, bringing in resources, what the communication plans are going to be. So we have all these major factors already planned in advance, but you can't always predict the inevitable. So you have to be nimble enough to make adjustments. So if these events devolve potentially into what we call an incident action plan or IAP, now it's even more important to abandon some of the things that you stated previous in your plan and understand the value in what Eisenhower said with planning is indispensable. So that collaboration that we have at the command post by co-locating and figuring out what kind of medical component or hazmat component or other challenges we may have to mitigate an emergency at an incident, aside from just a few transports where there's something so significant could happen. So our preparation is in the event action plans on campus at USC for events that happen there. The collaboration and relationships are extremely important. If those events become greater into where they develop in what we call an incident, now we are going to start collaborating even more, where we're making dynamic decisions, and we have to make informed decisions based on those things. And prior to all that, when we were talking about the community, in our planning process, we like to pursue an interest in the neighborhood councils and Department of Neighborhood Empowerment in the EAP phases of it. In the IAP phases of it, that's more of your emergency.
JT, we're recording this program, and 10 years down the road, if somebody watches this program, would really call me committing malpractice if I didn't ask as a moderator how the current pandemic, the COVID-19, has affected those plans that we've been speaking about from your eyes. And I'm going to ask the same question to each of our panel members.
So the question is,
how has COVID affected your planning?
It's totally disruptive. It disrupted because nobody anticipated this. No one across the globe really anticipated that here we are a year from now still talking about social distancing, mask wearing, and USC, as is the case with most universities, at least in the state of California, virtual. So I think it's impacted us in a way that I think it has been very disruptive, but it also has allowed for us to, in anticipation of other potential long-term crises, to get real creative in how we respond. And case in point, we've had to look at, how do we safely respond to incidences of large-scale student parties now? How do we effectively do that? How do we communicate to our stakeholders the importance of all of the things that the CDC is requiring? So I think, if I were to look back, look forward and think about what I would think should have been lessons learned from this, is we should be very proficient and have protocols in place that would allow for us to better withstand these type of very, very long-lasting crises. But I think from our vantage point, with our relationships with the community, it also provided us opportunity to educate them. So I think it's been very disruptive, Frank. It's caused us to get creative in our approaches to communicating to our community, and also how we respond effectively and keep our personnel and keep our community safe through this as well.
Steve?
Yeah, one of the things that really came out of this is how we've been able to take our in-person emergency operations center and make it virtual. And we've learned a lot from that. And using the virtual emergency operations center has allowed us to bring in key stakeholders while we're all separated and still manage the emergency and have boots on the ground on our campus. The other thing is we've really looked at our procedures related to cascading incidents. If you have a pandemic going on and now you have an earthquake, what does that mean? And so we've created some planning annexes to address the fact that we have to make sure we're social distancing at the same time we might have to evacuate a building in an emergency. And then finally, our business continuity, and this is something I would stress to everybody on this, is to really look at your business continuity plans. This has really showed us how important those plans are, especially for the staffing portion, when you could have so many people out that are sick or taking care of their dependents, and making sure that your critical functions have those procedures in place and how you're going to continue to operate during a crisis.
JD?
Yes.
So same question to you. How has COVID affected LA City Fire and your planning as well as your delivery of services?
It's affected us on every level. Our delivery of services, our technological capabilities, our training, our collaboration with our partners. But these are obstacles we have to overcome as first responders out in the streets. We don't have the opportunity to stay home and not provide service. That's why we're here. And that's why this panel is here. When you look at the importance of these partnerships, it just reinforces not just technology, but more, again, in the public-private partnerships. For example, vaccination. We're partnering with USC, not in an emergency situation, but beginning in March on campus for a vaccination site. We've got a mega site at Dodger Stadium. We're starting another one out in Woodland Hills at Pierce College. And now in March, we'll have another one with USC. So during this pandemic, it's affected our ability to provide the services that we normally have. We've had over 500 of our own members on this department come down with COVID. So it has instrumental effect, but we understand the value of, again, partnerships with the CDC, Department of Health Services, USC, LAPD, and CORE in providing these vaccinations on a non-emergency scale, but still developing those event action plans, because this one's not an emergency. And then looking at the stakeholders and what their impact has in getting this right. Because if we don't solicit input from John Thomas and Steve on how to operate at USC and LAPD when there's other legal issues going on, we're going to miss the mark on that. But to the point of the earthquake, those are your large scale issues. It will even go beyond the capabilities that our organization of 3,500 members may have challenges in even providing. So again, looking at FEMA, looking at NIMS, our National Incident Management System, our SAMS, our statewide emergency management systems, but on a broader scale. And I joke about this because I lived in Sylmar on February 9th, 1971, and I lived in Northridge on January 17th, 1994. So people always want to know where I live today so they can stay away from me. But on a serious level, what's so important we've learned from all this is our abilities to provide these services are compromised even with the partnerships when they're large scale like an earthquake, which reinforces the importance of community resiliency. And all of us working with our community and our neighborhood councils and facilitating a greater success for public safety by having a community that's more involved in it. So that is another major variable that's become a prominent theme that we've learned on how we need to improve to provide those services.
And Frank, can I add one more twist?
Of course, JT.
The whole thing is in the middle of this, we also had to deal with some massive protests. And it really caused, a great strain on all of the first responder entities in the city of LA. And to tie in something that Steve and Dr. Drake both mentioned is, it's just the importance of just having those, the relationships are important, but also being able to get creative in the midst of it, because we're human as well. So the impact of the coronavirus didn't jump over our first responders. We had to deal with diminished personnel resources in the midst of a pandemic, but then these massive protests that were really causing them to even diminish further, So it was disruptive in the sense of it being a pandemic, but I think it was compounded by the fact that we saw some unprecedented sizes of people gathering. And I recall there was a massive protest at USC, and I'm actually, the students had asked me to be a part of the protest, and I'm actually marching with the protesters, and I get a call from Ronnie Villanueva, who's on the fire department, and this is the power of these relationships. He calls me and he says, "Hey, JT, your protesters, we got to run a fire truck through there. So can you get them off to the side of the street?" And so fortunately, I had a rapport and I was able to do that. But the last thing that most police departments or departments of public safety would expect while they're in a protest to get a call from someone in the fire department because they need help, and I was able to facilitate that, but it would have never happened if I didn't know and we hadn't worked together in non-crisis times.
So true. I want to kind of shift now the conversation a little bit to the speed of information, the effect of it. It was one of my former colleagues, unfortunately, we lost him, but Warren Bennis, a couple of decades ago, began recognizing the importance of technology in our business school, and his teachings and his writings focused on the importance of collaboration and collaborative governance among various sectors, public, private, and not-for-profit. Today, of course, fast forward that to today, my goodness, the effect of technology has changed the world, right? So talk a little bit about the technology that we use to both educate, inform, as well as keep safe our USC community, because I think it's consistent with what cities are doing. My city, for example, we have a daily interaction with our community now through social media, and our constituencies expect transparency at the speed of light. Sometimes a little bit faster than speed of light, I'd like to say. But talk a little bit about technology, JT, and then I'll go to Steve, and then we'll talk to JD about their use of technology.
Well, yeah, one of the things that we're blessed at USC is the university has invested significantly into technology. We have one of the largest CCTV monitoring stations and network of cameras of anyone in Southern California, and they're monitored 24/7. So it's a huge force multiplier for us to have this network of cameras that not only aids our department, but it also aids all of the first responders in our community, because the vast majority of these cameras that are being monitored, they're on the city streets. And that was worked out through a partnership with the city of Los Angeles to allow for a significant safety in the neighborhoods. So we have a network of not only the cameras that are monitored, but it's very high quality, high tech camera system with video analytics. And it's tapped in and utilized by the fire department, police department, even some of our state and federal entities. We also have a vehicle license plate recognition system. Again, another force multiplier that helps in the solving of crimes, traffic collisions. That's a very important piece of how we operate and help keep the community safe. The other is our emergency notification system. We have a vast emergency notification system that allows for us to push out critical information relative to whatever the crisis may be. It could be an emerging crime issue. It could be, yes, there was a earthquake. It could be during an active shooter scenario, shelter in place. So the technology is really pushing forward public safety and allowing for us to do a lot more quicker, as you mentioned, Frank. But and I see it only evolving and becoming more advanced. But those are some of the things that we have in place that I really don't know how we could keep that community safe if we didn't have those things.
Right. Steve?
Yeah, and adding to JT, the Livesafe app that we have allows people, when they report an incident, to share video or still photos of an incident, which also helps speed up the process to get information out to the responders out in the field. And our university actually, just in the past couple of weeks, is obtaining a virtual EOC software. As actually the City of Los Angeles Emergency Management Department over the summer also obtained the same software. And so through this, we're going to be be able to communicate even more effectively by sharing information in real time, which will allow us that if we could come together, make decisions and determine what's going on, then we could even, faster, we could get information out to the public, out to our community and surrounding community. And soon, once we have the software fully up, we look forward to working with the city of Los Angeles on interacting with them with this software as well, and possibly even in the future for these pre-planned events like football games, where we could all have a same operating picture at the same time.
JD, what about the city of LA?
Yeah, many of the same issues that Chief Thomas and Steve brought up. Our communications is certainly facilitated, and it's expedited in that process too. We also now have command vehicles where we're using pilot programs for drones so that we can have better intelligence in our emergency operations and see a broader perspective of what's going on than that myopic lens we may have at the command post. But it helps us also quickly analyze what's going on in buildings because we can download information about building layouts. It facilitates response routes that are faster. So the technology has helped us not only in the emergency response, but also in the training and education with our public safety partners as well. We've learned to use greater platforms like Zoom and Blackboard and realize that in a city comprising 470 square miles and providing those services with USC, that we can become geographically challenged. So that helps us. And we all know there's a thing called traffic in Los Angeles as well. So there's been a lot of good fallout that has come from the technology. And I have to shout out for USC's IT, the transition as an adjunct professor here at USC in performance management to go from on campus to online within a matter of weeks. The information technology that USC provided to facilitate the success of their instructors and professors, who myself included, were not real proficient at some of those mediums. So that was huge on a USC level and also in an LAFD platform as well. So the dissemination of information and the provision of services as well as the training is all technological advances. Yes, there's challenges, but in many respects, it's made us a better organization.
So in my public administration classes, I always say, I love my colleagues and I love theory, but if you can't implement it, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist, right? So for those of us who are on the ground and where implementation is so important, what are we doing, JT? And I'll go around again with respect to our outreach with our stakeholders to make sure that we implement some of these things we're talking about. For example, the vaccine is great, but if you don't take it, we're not going to be able to build that herd immunity that ultimately we need to beat the virus, for example, right? There are examples like that all over the place. And I think that's critical. So what are you pushing or what are you saying to our constituency and stakeholders, JT, for us to be able to implement some of the things that you talked about?
Well, that is indeed a challenge, because one of the things that we have to contend with, and I'm going to show my generational biases, is young people tend to look at there being invincible. I mentioned earlier that we're still constantly breaking up parties. So, what is the effective way to communicate to one of our largest stakeholder groups, which is our students, the importance, that you're going to have to bypass, your social activities so that we can reach herd immunity so that you can get back to a normal university experience. And that's a challenge. That's very, very difficult. I wish, Frank, I could tell you that we have, effectively, solved that issue, but we haven't, and we're constantly looking at what are the best ways that we can communicate that. And in absence in that particular stakeholder group, we've had to utilize the leverage of student affairs and actually bring in the student judicial process to really hammer home and put some repercussions in place when we have that. And one of the other things that compound effective communication at USC is not only the size and scope, but it's a global campus community. We have students that are virtually from every corner of the globe, and we have to navigate our way through not only language barriers, but also some cultural barriers when it comes to, the acceptability of the vaccine, even bridging the gap of their perceptions of law enforcement, So there are unique challenges in communication where I found to be the most effective, and again, back to relationships, is having knowledge and knowing the key members of those groups. For instance, the international student groups. It's very important to me to have a great relationship with the president of the Chinese Student Scholar Association, because that's my mouthpiece to all of that stakeholder group. They may not listen to me, but they will to that leader. And that's how I push out information, identifying who are the key who the key drivers of various stakeholder groups, having a good relationship with them, and pushing out information through those channels. But Frank, I wish I could tell you we've solved this, but we haven't.
Any wisdom from your side, Steve?
The big thing about knowing if we're implementing it, if it's working, is the after action process that we utilize. Whenever we have an incident or, of course, an exercise, we will always review it, debrief it, determine what worked well, what can we do better, and then we'll build those improvements into our plans, into our training, into our exercises, so that we can have a continuous improvement program in place for emergency management.
JD, I suspect implementation is on your mind on a daily basis as an assistant chief, right?
Absolutely. And appropriately blending the academic with the practical, because like you, Dr. Zerunyan, I think it's important to be a practitioner, and I truly espouse the importance of that in the classes that I teach. As Steve's point, after action reviews are paramount to success. We don't want to tacitly condone behaviors that are not conducive to public safety or going to jeopardize the safety and welfare of our members. So it's important to address those and continually try to improve. But it also coincides with paradigms in public administration and what's going on. In the early 80s, strategic planning was a new thing that came out that was so important. It started in the private sector and evolved into the public sector and had application there. And then they found that these plans are great, but they become rhetorical paperweights if nobody acts upon them. So now a prominent theme is performance management, where we look at inputs, activities, outputs, and the differences between outputs and outcomes, and how we're achieving goals. And then to manage it, how are we going to be doing the appropriate monitoring, evaluating, and analyzing so that we can learn through this iterative, fluid process of improvement, whether it's after action reviews or whether it's in your EAPs, your event action plans, or your incident action plans, continually soliciting input from your stakeholders, from your community, from the internal and external stakeholders where possible, and strive to continually improve. And you do it through these public-private partnerships, as we're seeing with the vaccinations, because you asked about that. We're getting better at developing plans or event action plans for these vaccination sites. And again, in March, I'm very hopeful and confident that through the collaboration with USC and our department and the CDC, DHS, CORE, and other public and private partners, that we're going to have a successful operation also in the four levels of parking at USC where these vaccination sites are going to be run. It's a major challenge, but we can do it.
It sure is. So at this point, let me start. We're populating some questions as the audience is asking, and I encourage the rest of the audience to go ahead and put in the Q&A portion of your screen any questions that you may have. I will try to get them all. Try to make it as short as possible. Some of them are very, very long, so I don't want to keep reading it. But let me start with a few questions from the audience. First, a very quick one. I think you answered some of this already, but let's just button it up. What platform tool is USC using for virtual EOC, web EOC, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, or a combination?
We are going to be utilizing Eoc Eoc is one of the, there's Eoc, WebEoc, and a few others like it was mentioned, but Eoc is the product that we'll be utilizing, and the City of Los Angeles is also currently using.
Excellent. Anything to add, anybody else on the panel? Okay. The next question is, maintaining adequate staffing levels to ensure continuity of service is extremely difficult in our rural communities with small budgets and staff size. We provide public water, sewer, fire, and park services to a permanent population of approximately 3,500 and tourists that visit about 10,000. Any suggestions on planning for continuity when qualified staffing resources and financial means to secure them are not readily available? I guess financial means is not really the issue for you guys, but perhaps you do have reduced staffing. What do you do?
I would say, and Steve can speak to it even more broadly, utilize, the volunteer corps, the ham radio operators. There's always avenues where you can tap into existing maybe hobby groups and individuals in the community that have an interest in providing their expertise or utilizing what they do to benefit the community. And maybe, Steve, you want to talk about the ham radio and the CSERT programs that we have at USC.
Yeah, certainly the volunteer groups that you have is a force multiplier to help you, and that's kind of the concept behind even the CERT program that was created by LA City Fire Department many years ago, which is the paid first responders aren't going to necessarily all be able to handle all the emergencies. So utilizing the citizens and train them properly to be able to provide these services is really a key. But when it comes to you mentioned in the question, the continuity of operations, if you even have one person that can facilitate the planning process with the various departments, it could work. It's just knowing exactly the process of what to do. It's identifying, sitting down with these departments and asking the question, what do you do on a regular basis? And what are those critical functions that must occur? And then identifying what those thresholds are on time before you can't do without that particular service. So for example, what are the things that must be up and running in the first hour, first 12 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours, 1 week? And that helps you prioritize the functions that you normally do on a day-to-day basis. And then if you find yourself with less staffing, people are out sick or whatnot, then your plan should address how you shift your staffing to those more critical functions. And of course, that would mean possibly some cross-training that needs to take place to make sure people know how to deliver those functions. And so it really, by just having at least one administrator that could sit down with these groups and walk through this process, it's called a business impact analysis. And there are resources out there. Disaster Resource Institute is one example, or the International Association of Emergency Managers, another group where you could really find these resources to understand how to do that process.
I can see a course developing, Steve, based on this conversation right here. Maybe we can have some of our folks come to USC and we can do a full course on this topic. So the next question is, how would you suggest special district builds relationship with, it says sheriff department, but I'll replace it with any police department or any law enforcement, I presume. JT, how do you do it at USC that special districts perhaps could use your wisdom a little bit?
I think it comes down to, identifying where are the active groups in the community, and then plugging into those, because I'm a firm believer that public safety is a shared responsibility, but I also believe that just by virtue of having ongoing, consistent avenues to communicate effectively with them, either through neighborhood groups, community organizations, that if you're in a position that addresses public safety, you should be a part of those. And even if they don't have anything to do with it, I think by virtue of establishing your accessibility, you will find that, there are some places in any of the community organizations to push forward the message and then also build relationships that could morph into actionable groups that can help advance public safety.
JD, any thoughts, any advice from your end as to how others should be engaging your department? I mean, it's very similar in concept.
Yes, and I agree with your idea about a class or something coming, and it's called performance management, where you have three major tenets. You look at performance leadership, which would involve strategic planning, establishing a vision, mission, values, goal strategies on how you're going to achieve those goals, actionable ways through goal tactics to achieve them, and then benchmarks to know when you did. And then finalizing also an ability to measure your successes. Again, looking at your inputs, what kind of activities you're engaging in, your resources you're allocating, and are your outcomes meeting the outputs? And then the last part is monitoring, evaluating, and learning what's going on with this so that you continually make the changes you need to. Hence, planning is indispensable. So it needs to be that iterative process to make us get better continually.
The next question is a little longer, so I'm going to try to read it. I'm a GM for a mosquito and vector county. In regards to foregoing relationship with county or even more local level, first responders, is there regular county level meetings of leaders within those first responder agencies that I could seek out in order to educate them on our services, our role as a public health official, and the types of action we take in public health emergencies in response to mosquito or vector-borne diseases? Also, I would like to explore ways that those agencies may work with us on those responses or even assist them in other local emergencies. JD, maybe we can start with you because you are a public fire department for a very large city, obviously. How do you do this?
Well, it sounds to me like he or she may be looking for avenues to reach out to public safety officials to involve mosquito abatement and the potential they have for transmissible diseases or viruses. Once again, collaboration, inclusivity, and participation. I would reach out to your public safety partners on many levels, whether it's the CDC, DHS, or your local fire service, and find out when they are having some of these plans meetings and get involved in the collaborative effect of this, because mosquito abatement could have a large part in this, and you really can't leave out your stakeholders. I have to admit that is a stakeholder that I might have left off of our event action plan or incident action plan and not thought about that. And that's why that diversity of opinion is so important. So I would have them reach out and find out when their specific meetings are going on and how they're going to handle those things and attempt to be included in the process.
Rightfully so. And in fact, I think you, both of you or all of you mentioned this silo effect. I think my advice, wearing my mayor hat, perhaps is that, it's a two-way street. It's not just one way of engagement. It's an engagement from all of our existing governmental bodies, which I call the umbrella of governance, JD, if you remember from your class. So the umbrella of governance it involves special districts, involves cities, involves fire departments, fire districts, library districts, all of that, because we serve our communities with all of that, all of those mechanisms. A city alone can't do it. It's impossible. So my advice in response to the question is, please engage your leaders in your county, in your city, at all levels, and educate them on what you do. Because for the most part, the problem with some of our governance mechanisms are that we find ourselves in various silos, and it's very difficult to get out of those silos if we don't try. So my, I guess, concluding remarks would be, and I'm going to turn to all of you for kind of a short concluding remark. My concluding remark would be collaboration wins the day. And I encourage all of our special districts to go home and after this, to start making calls to various agencies to find leaders that are willing to collaborate with you. You'll be surprised how many people will answer that call because it's a mutual gain process. Mm-hmm. I, as a mayor, win when my constituents know the difficulty or the danger of a mosquito-borne disease, for example. It's part of my job as a mayor to make sure that my community is safe. Safety takes various aspects. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. All right. As I'm thanking all of you, let's start final thoughts. JD.
I would like to just reinforce what you just said, Dr. Zerunyan. I think that is paramount to our success as a public safety and emergency service provider. Public services improve through collaborative, substantive partnerships. Period.
JT.
Ditto. Shared, and then I'd add shared responsibility. And then the other last thing from the perspective of a chief, and I've talked to many chiefs, we hear a lot of the negatives and the complaints about our departments. It's rare that we get someone says, hey, I work vector control. I have an idea. Would you like to meet? And I would just suggest reaching out to them because often we look for ways to connect and collaborate. Don't discredit just a phone call if you can, or email or letter saying, hey, I'd like to meet with you. I got an idea. And if it enhances public safety, if I'm that chief, I'm going to make time to meet with you and hear what you've got to say.
Absolutely.
Steve, last but not least.
Last words, exchange business cards before the crisis. Build those relationships.
So true, so true. So be prepared, forge those relationships and create that trust. Well, gentlemen, I thank you all. You are my dear friends and you remain so. You didn't screw up, so it's all good. This is great. Thank you very much. It's been really fun to engage you to a conversation. For our first panel, I hope that our participants, well over 130, 140 of them, have really gotten something out of this, and we look forward to seeing them in our classroom. As I said, maybe we'll get some feedback from this and create some more opportunities for education. I thank you all. We're adjourned for this session. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome a couple of practitioners, one from the private sector and one from the public sector here in LA County, to talk about management of an emergency, actually. Again, feel free to look up their bios, as I will not read them to you. Thomas Jacobus is the Principal Manager of Business Resiliency at Southern California Edison, a very important function, as we know, particularly in the state of California. Our resiliency is critical to be able to manage all of the responsibility that Thomas has and Edison has. And then on the public side, Kevin Mcgowan, who is the Director of Emergency Operations Center, the EOC at Los Angeles County, the beautiful picture that you see, the background of it, which is a great facility. Some of us have had the opportunity to visit. But gentlemen, I'm going to withdraw, let you have a conversation, and I'll be back in a few minutes when it's time for Q&A, perhaps to moderate the Q&A portion. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for hosting us for this meeting. It was great to hear the last panel speak. Could we go to the next slide? So I'll give a quick overview of SCE, just so you have some context. I'll talk a little bit about the electric sector's role in planning and response, some of the private public sector partnerships, and how we work together during emergencies. Then I think you'll hear from Kevin, how we've partnered together in the past. So if we could go to the next slide. So just a broad brush, SCE has a large service territory. It's 50,000 square miles. We serve about 14 million people. That's about 5 million customers, 180 incorporated cities, 15 counties, et cetera. So could we go to the next slide? And contrary to popular belief, we do not serve the city of LA. That's LA Department of Water and Power. In terms of the electric industry's role, we have quite a few similarities with the county emergency management agencies and emergency management agencies on the public sector side. We both have public health and safety concerns. We have different responsibilities, but it's as it was shared in the last panel, it is absolutely a shared responsibility. I mean, we have the need for mutual aid just like the public sector does. And we need to be able to seamlessly plug in to emergency responses, whether it's a wildfire or a debris flow or a mudslide, or a big cyber attack, whatever the case may be. We need to be able to plug in seamlessly to any emergency situation. An electric industry or electric utility could be, a lead response agency. When we're looking at public safety power shutoff, we are definitely playing a leadership role there in determining, what the scope of that event is going to be. We could also be a cooperating agency in the case of a wildfire or even the pandemic, and looking at, vaccination locations and vaccine storage locations and working with those customers and taking extra steps. So there are many different roles or different roles that we can play. Some of the key differences, we are as an investor-owned electric utility, we are regulated by many different entities, from the Public Utility Commission to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the Western Electric Coordinating Council, and and many others that dictate the rules of how we have to operate. And we have to operate within that framework. We're not eligible, generally speaking, for federal disaster relief. So if a Stafford Act declaration is made, we as an investor-owned utility, we are generally not eligible for that funding. And we're also generally not required to adopt any of the public sector frameworks for emergency management or response. But we learned about 10 years ago that it is absolutely key to do that, to mount an effective, or really to develop an effective plan or have an effective response. We go to the next slide. So basically, how do you make SCE sort of fit into, this is a kind of a tear out of at least a version of the Southern California Catastrophic Earthquake Plan. And you look at that complex, organization or unified coordination group and state coordinating officer, federal coordinating officer. Geez, as a private company, where the heck do we fit in? And how do we plug into that? We go to the next one. Yep, and and advance one more time. And so how we do that? Go back one, sorry. Yep, so how we do that is we have adopted and implemented many of the public sector frameworks. And again, that's why it was great to hear the panel before, because we're all speaking the same language, which is the strength of the standardization with the standardized emergency management system here in California, the broader public sector frameworks of NIMS, National Incident Management System, National Infrastructure Protection Plan, National Response Framework. What we've implemented at Southern California Edison is consistent with all those, state and national frameworks. We organize and plan in a manner that's consistent with the public sector, how we develop emergency plans, how we organize our response. We use incident command system. The training that we do is the exact same as any public sector emergency responder would get. And we also structure our exercises in the same way, using Homeland Security exercise evaluation protocol. So we plan, train, exercise, and respond in the same way that the public sector does. And developing the partnerships, which I think you heard from the panel before, is incredibly important. We've done that through establishing a critical lifelines work group, which we established back in 2015 in partnership with LA County. And that group includes water, wastewater, telecom, pipeline, county emergency managers, city emergency managers, Department of Homeland Security. And these are forums where we can share best practices, we can review each other's plans. This group took a bit of a back burner last year because we were all busy chasing the COVID ball, but we're reinvigorating that this year. I mean, that's just one forum for outreach. We, Southern California Edison, go to the operational areas, which is how the state framework is laid out. Each county is an operational area, and we share our emergency response plans and solicit feedback on those plans during these operational area meetings on a regular basis. It also helps us to set and manage expectations for different things. People might remember the rotating outages that happened last year. Well, a couple of years before that, we had, done a big communication full court press to get out to the counties and explain, here's what a rotating outage is. It's just part of the planning process, and educating people on how we operate, and learning what are the essential elements of information that the counties or our stakeholders need to be able to plan and make decisions. So there are a number of different forums for doing that. And let's see, what else do I have? So some of the challenges to doing that. So security, how much data do we share? I think we've made great strides in being able to share, certain information with the counties via GIS that are automatic pushes of information, so they can see, areas that are potentially impacted or impacted by outages. But building trust, because again, the panel before said it. When I was new to the business world, a great mentor of mine said, "Tom, the bottom line is that business is all about personal relationships, and people do business with people that they know and they trust. And it takes a while to build that trust. But man, once it's there, it does speed things up quite a bit." So I've known Kevin for years now, and many of his peers through these interactions, both the critical lifelines and going to the operational area meetings. And it is amazing that the benefits that can reap. So some of the benefits, in partnering, prior to the Thomas fire, which if folks remember back to that was 2017. Through collaboration and partnership, Edison has sponsored agency representative training, in partnership with the counties to, again, help bring more groups to the table in managing emergencies, people that maybe didn't know how to navigate the system. And that's from, it could be the Surfrider Foundation to, the people that deal with, animals during emergencies and evacuations, which is, really a thing, to coordinating on, setting up local assistance centers so that we're sending, our Edison people to these sites and really speeding the coordination process. I mean, other things that we've done is partner up on mitigation strategies. Back when we were preparing for El Nino in 2015, we ended up putting, it says 12 megawatts. It was 80 megawatts of diesel generators in Santa Barbara County, which if you think about diesel in Santa Barbara County, that's a dirty word. But we were preparing for, what was supposed to be a Godzilla El Nino, ended up being an El Nino. Nobody could find the person named El Nino that year. We didn't get the rain, I think, till the year afterwards. But taking steps like this required, was an unprecedented amount of coordination. And this is just, a couple of examples of the things that can happen when we work together, because we're always, stronger together than we are apart. And I think that may be my last slide, and I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to be here today to present. When Tom and I were talking about this presentation and building off of the theme for our section of it, Tom, you did a great job laying out a lot of the concepts and those basic structures and how we partner. And I just want to echo the comments that really the beginning of this all starts with those partnerships and making sure that you have that trust and those relationships built, because as we see time and time again, and we've worked a lot of different emergencies together, from oil spills and fires to debris flows and floods, through what we're dealing with COVID. And just to amplify an example Tom mentioned related to establishing mass vaccination sites that have ultra cold storage chain requirements that you can't lose power on. So being able to just reach out to people that have the specific, function or mission space that can help assist you with your mission is critical. And I kind of, just to build off of Tom's presentation, I would bucket this one concept with solving complex and complicated problems with simplicity. And one of the ways that you achieve that simplicity is through tried and true and trusted partners. And so I just wanted to, say I appreciate Tom and the support and coordination that we've had during our emergencies. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today to build on that. So really, I think at the end of the day, your emergency response and your emergency management programs, and then the actual implementation of these, whether it's in the preparedness and planning phase, the response phase, or recovery phase, comes down to a couple of key critical elements. And one of those is a cornerstone element is the art of capacity building and capability building. If at the end of the day we talk about building out plans, those plans usually don't mean anything if you don't have capability and capacity to implement them. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of my time building off of Tom's discussion related to the notions of having standardized processes and those realistic aspects that really give us the opportunity to coordinate and collaborate in what is probably one of the most complicated and complex regions in the country, if not in the world. I know that there's a lot of people on this call that aren't necessarily just from LA County. It's a broad group. But even when you look at it from the microcosm of LA County, it doesn't get much more complicated and complex in that aspect of local government. But then when you bridge our whole metropolitan area with all of the surrounding counties and Southern California as a whole, the only way we can effectively respond to emergencies is through a standardized process. And it's challenging because on any given day, our organizations have interests and their own mission space, and we generally work towards our governance groups to accomplish that mission. And that all kind of goes out the window when we have these large scale emergencies that impact us in a variety of ways. So I hope if everyone has a chance to walk away with this with a couple of different nuggets, at least from LA County's perspective. One is to, spend some time thinking about your strategic preparedness and planning efforts and how you are going to, during an earthquake, so to speak, or for example, how are you going to implement a decision-making process that is integrated with a much larger effort underway? And what is your organizational structure look like? And I think the image that Tom showed encapsulates what is an interesting environment that we work in. So if you're a special district, a city, a county, a public sector or private sector entity, we all kind of have these different marching orders. And so as the county, we're a part of that infrastructure within, or the structure within the state emergency management system. And we don't really have a choice whether or not we're going to use the standardized emergency management system. But as Tom alluded to, that isn't necessarily the case with everyone in the area that we're working in. And so SCE being able to bridge into that and bring, even though they're not necessarily required, work towards adopting, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the entire structure, the entire decision-making process, but tailoring it to your organization, your own organization's culture, but having some standardization to it so that you can plug in with those governmental entities is critical. And a story Tom and I were sharing with each other before this presentation, I think amplifies it, which is, if your organization calls the lead person in that response, like the president of response or whatever the notion is, and then we have a wildland fire and we're doing evacuations and we need to get a hold of that person, the term of art that is consistent across the board in the governmental structure is the incident commander. And just that simple little nuance can be a very big deal between effectively coordinating, because it comes down to the thing that we always hear in all of our after actions, which is the element that people want to have the most success out of, but tends to be the most challenging, which is communication. And even just using simple terminology can be a barrier in effective communication. So from that strategic level, looking at how you're doing your decision-making process, what your organizational structures are like, and how those integrate into other organizations, because on the big disasters, we know that no one's at it alone. We all have to row in the same boat in that same direction. Focusing then on action planning. So understanding the difference between when we're talking strategic planning on those preparedness days, but then when we get into the actual emergency and that response and recovery mode, transitioning out of that arena, bringing our decision-making process and organizational structures from that strategic environment in what LA County we refer to as our action planning mode, which is our real-time planning and decision-making when emergencies are occurring. And I think the critical aspect of that is making sure all of your functions are integrated across the board. And it goes back to the theme I think we've been hearing from the previous panel and then now with Tom and I, which is you can't have complete integration unless you have those partnerships. And the strain that occurs with those emergencies really requires that those partnerships are tried and true, and that there's access to those partnerships. We've learned, all of us on this conference have learned firsthand with COVID, and it required all of us to take on new business practices like teleworking, which in some cases I think have disrupted some of our previous notions of how we would respond to an emergency. So my virtual background is actually what the EOC looked like 2 fire seasons ago, pre-COVID. And if you looked at our EOC when we had the Bobcat fire this year while COVID was occurring, it didn't look anything like this. But I would contest that our response to the Bobcat fire was just as good, if not better, than what we've done in the past on our responses. So it's the ability for us to be adaptive and flexible. And then a couple last thoughts I wanted to kind of leave the group with so we can keep some time for question and answer is, I think at the end of the day, when you go through these planning, training, exercising programs, and then you're actually in the emergency response business and you're responding to them. I think one of the things that is most important for us to continue to focus on is the prioritization of our efforts through the lens of limited resources. So I think when we all have a stark reminder when we actually start getting into the emergency that when we've been doing training, planning, exercising, that we maybe notionalize things, or we don't play to the notion that we will have limited resources and limited access to things. And that's where another key element in partnerships comes into play. Tom referenced mutual aid. There's a lot of different mutual aid systems in the state. Knowing your mutual aid system is critical. Knowing how you can bring resources to bear is critical. And it goes back to one of my initial concepts of capacity and capability building. We could all have the best plans in the world sitting on a shelf, but if you don't have the capability and capacity to implement them, they don't really mean that much. So at the end of the day, we have limited resources. We put a lot of our emphasis in our planning, our strategic planning towards, the earthquake hazard, because it is so daunting for LA County. And one thing that we know is going to be a big challenge is this limited resource issue. And I'll just tie off my remarks with Tom, myself, other people within the Southern California Edison leadership group and the LA County leadership group. Every year we have a very frank conversation through an exercise environment, a tabletop exercise environment, where we talk about how to prioritize efforts. And we're seeing this play out in Texas right now with what happens to a society when they have long duration power outages. And then how do you continue to do operations when restoration of that power is challenged by other elements? And you think of an earthquake and restoration of power and bringing power back up online, or any energy source back up online, when you have limited access to different areas because of infrastructure damage and stuff. And so a simple concept just of prioritizing effort and aligning those limited resources can be a game changer, because you might be using a resource to clear an area that turns out to be not a high priority area. Whereas if I had an open conversation with an organization like SCE, and SCE said, hey, Kevin, if you can get resources to this area to make it safe for us to provide restoration resources here, we would be able to re-energize this area by this date. And that might be a game changer as it results to life safety, property preservation for a specific area that we're trying to serve. So I think that's probably one of the things I wanted to leave the conference with the most, which is really starting to drill down as a collective, all of us together, of how do we prioritize and align efforts with the notion that we're going to have limited resources. So with that, that concludes my remarks, and I'll hand it back over to the doctor to continue us through the Q&A portion.
Well, gentlemen, it looks like you were so thorough that I don't see any questions. So thank you to both of you. Perhaps one last thought that you both could respond to. This came up in the earlier panel, and I think it's critical for special districts, perhaps at the implementation level. And you both mentioned it, the importance of communication and the importance of building relationships. I think last time the question was that sometimes special districts encounter difficulties in being part of emergency management or being a first responder, so to speak. How do they engage your respective organizations? What is the best way? Perhaps that could be a 1 minute from each parting concluding remarks. Tom, let's start with you.
Sure. I would say, so there are two ways. One is, through the Edison account rep that supports that particular account, assuming they're a customer. But what I would really recommend is through the operational area emergency management entity. If they have a special need or special consideration that really needs to be addressed, it's a public safety issue, raise it to the county will raise it to us if we need to loop them in specifically. And we've done that in the past in Kern County in particular, and been able to deal with the issue.
Kevin?
Yeah, to build off of Tom's point, like I think the structure exists. The structure exists in the sense that within the county, as the operational area, special districts do have a way of vectoring into that structure through our liaison officers. So first and foremost, all of our contact information for the members that are on this conference that are in Los Angeles County, go to our county's website and you'll get our contact information. And we're more than happy to engage with our countywide partners. I know I'll echo my counterparts in all of the other Southern California counties are all on board with that too. So step one is knowing who's who in the zoo, so to speak, and then reaching out to them. I think step two is the investment. And this, I don't say this lightly. Emergency management is kind of like the classic insurance dilemma, right? Which is, I have to pay bills today. Why would I pay bills for something that I might need 15 years from now, or something that is an unknown? We used to have a system like that with car insurance, and then we changed it, and now we require everyone to have car insurance for this very reason, which is the gamble of not investing in something that will come to fruition in some day. So I think from the county's perspective to the special district, it's definitely invest time and money and resources into an emergency management capability for your organization, so that you do have resources who can reach out to the county personnel that can reach out to the county and say, hey, these are issues that we have and we want to work towards solutions on. So those would be my two key points, would be make that contact and then have the resources available to continue that relationship going on.
Kevin, you, I think, addressed this, but there is a question that popped up that I want to make sure that perhaps you can answer as well. And the question is, how often do you update your public and private resource database? And you invited, of course, our listeners to engage. Do you pre-coordinate with your other sections, such as planning and logistics?
Yeah, so I'll take the stab at it, and then Tom, if he wants to weigh in on it. So as it relates to updating the databases for all of our contacts, so for County of Los Angeles, it's a no small feat, right? Like that's the climbing Mount Everest just in and of itself, with the sheer size and scale of everything that goes on in the county. 88 cities, thousands of special districts. It's a monumental task. So we do, but it's always a moving target. As quick as it's updated, there's going to be components of it that are out of date. So we always appreciate when organizations continually reach out to us, but it's an ongoing function. And then as it relates to the second part of that question about pre-coordinating with the different entities, I believe one of the tenets of the county's Office of Emergency Management is definitely to have this whole community, whole function approach to all of the different phases or iterations of our disaster life cycle. So the planning, preparedness, all the way through mitigation, recovery, and response, making sure all those functions are a part of all of those is one of our key tenets. So planning, logistics, management, communications, joint information, all of those elements are consistently tied together as they're going through those different life cycles. And I don't know of any other way to do this business successfully in another way. It's time consuming. I reemphasize this a lot, which is our business model is not to be necessarily efficient. Our business model is to be effective. And sometimes in emergency management, efficiency is not our outcome. Now, in some aspects, efficiency is critical. Running vaccine sites, obviously, you want to be efficient. But generally speaking, in the life safety game, sometimes you'll forego some efficiencies for effectiveness. And, it might seem redundant or duplicative to have all of these different functional groups of people consistently going through those processes together. But at the end of the day, I think that's what wins the game, so to speak. So, and I don't know, Tom, if you had anything else you wanted to add on to it.
I think, Kevin, SCE does reach out and try to coordinate ahead of time, not just with the counties, but with water agencies, telecommunication companies, generally critical infrastructure, each year, especially in advance of fire season. So we learned some lessons with that coordination, I think last year. And we need to do a better job. Room for improvement is always the biggest room in the house. So we're going to be looking at how we're engaging this year to maybe get a better result.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We're going to transition to our next panel. You have been absolutely terrific. The information you provided is very, very valuable. Thank you both. Hope to see you at USC as well. Feel free to reach out. We'll reach out, I'm sure. But thank you again to both of you.
Okay, thank you.
With that, I am going to directly transition into our next esteemed panel. These two gentlemen are absolutely the top of their game and the top of their disciplines. I am delighted to call Dr. Errol Southers, Professor Southers, my dear friend, longtime friend and colleague at USC, and my boss for a program in which I teach tomorrow. In fact, I'll be there, Errol, don't worry. But it's really, really great to have Errol as part of this panel. And of course, Professor Brian Levin and I share a bar membership here in the state of California. The two of us are trained lawyers. And also, it seems like we also share our licenses at the United States Supreme Court, where we're both members of the bar, which is an absolutely awe-inspiring event. I am sure if he took the oath, I took my oath before Justice Rehnquist and a bunch of the justices that were on the bench at the time. I don't know when you took it, Brian, but it was absolutely I was in awe. I was worried that I would not be able to say that I support and defend the Constitution of the United States, but I finally uttered it. But in any event, it's really great to have you both. I am going to kind of turn over the conversation to you, which is really a conversation about with the special districts, we talk about disasters, emergency preparedness, and Homeland Security is part of that conversation. Some of our special districts manage assets that are potentially in danger of some of the aspects of dangers that you actually are part of making sure that they don't happen, or at least you educate people that those things do not happen to us. So I'm delighted to have you both. I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to turn it over to both of you, the conversation. Your bios are with them, so I'm not going through them because I can't do justice to either one of you, reading 10, 20 pages of bio information. So we're not going to do that. So gentlemen, the floor is yours, and I'm going to come back for the Q&A portion to be able to facilitate that.
Well, Frank, thank you very much. It's always an honor and a privilege to be with you. And it's always an honor and privilege to be with you in this forum, because usually we're on a bike together somewhere between here and Palos Verdes, because we ride together. And I'm looking out the window now. We should be out there now. But thank you for having me here. I'm the president of your fan club, as you know, and certainly a huge fan of Brian's. And I serve on Brian's advisory board at his institution. So thank you, everyone, for having us today. What I'm going to do is share the screen. I promise not to kill you with PowerPoint, but there are some things I wanted to share as we talk about Homeland Security and how we got here today. And so I'm assuming everyone can see this. Brian, give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Oh, outstanding. Okay, technology's working. So let me just take you back a little ways, if I may. After 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security was stood up, we had this monumental task of taking 22 agencies and putting them under one umbrella, kicking and screaming, if you will. But more importantly, the big task at the moment before they even finished writing the 9/11 Commission report was, how do we protect a nation? And obviously, since the attack had focused on infrastructure with regards to the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, possibly the Capitol, which wasn't hit, we really had to figure out, how do we do this? So you've got 50 states, you've got a ton of infrastructure. And so all that to say, we started embarking on what would become the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which exists today. I'm quite honored to say that I participated in that effort. That's when Secretary Chertoff was the Secretary of Homeland Security, although we started this effort under Secretary Tom Ridge. And how did this play out? So what was decided is that we would put together, at the time, it's morphed between 16 and 18 different what we call CIKR, or critical infrastructure or key resource sectors. And these sectors were put together in such a way that every state would be responsible for essentially cataloging each of these different sectors in their state as related to their individual assets. And you can see you've got everything there from food and agriculture to water. So you've got all of these disparate systems, and I guess I don't have to tell this audience that 85% of these critical infrastructure key resource sectors are managed and controlled by the private sector. So with all due respect to being able to walk in to see people and say, we work for the government, we want to know everything you have and tell us all your secrets, it didn't quite work that way. And that's a whole other conversation we can have later as it relates to the protection of critical infrastructure information, which was another act that we had to put in place in order to work with the private sector. But I wanted you to see how huge this is. I guess I don't have to tell you that California has the largest database when it comes to CIKR in the country. We are double the state that's second to us, which is Texas. It's a huge undertaking. And so the last thing I'll show you here is that we were actually carrying out what was called HSPD 7, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 7, which was the identification, the prioritization, and the protection of the infrastructure sectors that I showed you previously. So the question then became, how do you compare an asset like a chemical plant next to a water purification plant, next to a dam, next to a government building? So what was essential for us was to come up with a way to take all of these entities that are already conducting assessments on their capacities and vulnerabilities and put them into a formula that made them somewhat comparable. I'm just showing you this so you understand the process that took place then and takes place now. You obviously, when we talk about these sectors, you've got physical assets, cyber assets, and human assets. And goals are set. I'll walk you through this very quickly. And we talk about those three different elements in the way of assets, systems, networks, and functions. Most importantly, we then are trying to assess risk. And by the way, risk is defined as consequences times vulnerabilities times threat. And so in the interest of staying on the non-classified part of this conversation, we were looking at risk equations that basically took a couple of things. Number one, how many people are going to die if that asset is compromised or destroyed? Second, what are the economic consequences to that asset if it's affected? Thirdly, what does it take to recuperate that asset? And more importantly, what are the psychological ramifications of that? That's how we tended to put together our prioritization process. So for example, if you had a chemical plant, we wanted to know if that chemical plant's destroyed by, let's just say, a weapon of mass destruction or an IED, how many people are going to die? What are the economic consequences? How do we reconstitute it? And psychologically, what happens to the population that's impacted by its destruction? Then protective programs are defined with regards to how to mitigate those challenges. And then we would measure the effectiveness of those programs. Now you can see the feedback loop that constantly goes to each one of those phases. That's because people need to understand, and Brian's going to talk about this, security is a dynamic process. It never ends. This was not about getting together a book that says we've got a whole assessment here on the ABC chemical plant. We're glad this is done and we put it on a shelf. No, next year we come back and look at a whole new series of threats because the threat is dynamic. We should know that because the World Trade Center got attacked in 1993 by a truck bomb. When the World Trade Center responded to that with regards to countermeasures in place so that wouldn't happen, they decided to fly aircraft into it. So as we have a dynamic threat, we have to have a dynamic process. I have this photo here. It was assumed that everybody who's on this call today is familiar with this room. This is, of course, in Sacramento at the State Emergency Operations Center. Spent many, many times there. And it's been activated because the other thing we had to take into consideration while I'm talking about man-enabled threats right now are the fact that we have to address Mother Nature. And we have no better example than what's going on in Texas right now. And Brian and I are good friends with Art Acevedo, who's chief in Houston, who is just probably not sleeping at all because of who would have ever thought in the 21st century that we are trying to protect people from dying from hypothermia in America. And that's where we are. So as it relates to fires, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and snowfall, we have some issues to address. So I just wanted to show all of you that as an intro so we could have a conversation about what the Homeland Security Department was intended to do, how it's structured, how we organize ourselves in these different sectors to protect critical infrastructure, and how the entire country took that on. And so, Brian, I'm going to toss to you as we get into a more dynamic conversation about everything from protecting infrastructure to protecting each other from more dynamic and more interesting threats, as we both know.
Well, thank you so much. It is always such a thrill. We love Dr. Southers over at Cal State, and you can always depend on him when something crazy happens somewhere for him to have the kind of measured and educated voice that we need. That's why we want to see more of you. I am a little distressed, though, at his leisure domain, if I can say this in front of this esteemed audience, which includes not only professionals in the industry, but also a lot of Trojans. And I've never criticized him publicly before, but I want to say that I really think it's unethical that you invited me to speak on this Friday when you probably knew that there would be a UCLA guy charged for multiple felonies. So, so he's always ahead of the curve. But in any event, I'm referring to one of the Capitol insurrectionists who is being detained now, not pre-trial release, and he was, or is rather, an anti-Semite bigot who also attended UCLA. So, wow, we're talking about timing. But thank you so much, Dr. Southers, for everything you've done for us here in the state and everything that you've done nationally. I'm Brian Levin, and what I thought would be interesting to talk about is what's been going on a little bit with respect to white supremacy. I don't want to fill you up with PowerPoint stuff because that can sometimes bore people, but I think it's important. If you look at what he was saying, he was talking about, the organizational structure and coordination that we need with respect to responding to these always mutating and evolving threats. And to bring it home, what I'd like to do is start off with a couple of examples, then go to an overview. And where he was looking at where assets were, some of the interesting research that we've done. This is why I always love doing presentations with him. He has such alacrity over so many different topics that it's almost like Tinker's Everest to Chance for those of you who still watch baseball. But in any event, I'm going to start with a couple of examples of why this is a real thing, some recent overviews, and then look at some of the timing issues because we know the places. But let's look at some of the timing stuff. So let me start off with this. I hope can folks see the slides? Oh, fantastic. We'll talk a little bit about 2019, then we'll talk about 2020. But let's talk about 2019. Hate crimes were up slightly, but more violent. And the reason why I like hate crimes isn't because, no, I don't like hate crimes, but as a data tool, is it's really a good barometer of what's going on with intergroup relations. Let me give you an example. What do you think the worst day for hate crime was in 2019? It was the day that impeachment was announced. So it's almost like a barometer of conflicts and divisions that are in society that you can get on a timely basis, and you can break down because the FBI, of which he was an esteemed FBI SWAT guy in his younger days. He hasn't been repelling lately. I hope not. Although I did refer him. I did refer my neighbor to him for Christmas tree lighting stuff, because I think we can still do that. But I could never do that even back in the day. But let's look at some of the things. 2019 hate crimes were up. It was the third consecutive year of 7,000 plus. Moreover, we saw increases in the largest cities. And since 2008, elections and political violence really clustered around when hate crimes went up too. And what we found was words matter. So for instance, this year, it was a combination of obviously the terrible pandemic that we're having, but also the horrible racist rhetoric around it, where we saw increases. So for instance, if I were to, and I had to trim it because otherwise I'd never be invited back to SC. Fight on. Anyway, one of the things that we found was a hodgepodge all over the country in 2020 with regard to hate crimes, but we found that anti-Asian went up significantly. And what we found was, if you looked at COVID deaths, for instance, in New York City, it really kind of followed that, but more the rate of increase as opposed to the actual deaths, if that makes any sense to folks. So March and April for worse for that. I'm only using this as an example of, if you see something in the news or see a lot of stuff monitored online and it involves your stuff, whether it's 5G facilities, which are part of the conspiracy web out there, it's something you might want to pay attention to. Moreover, extremists are more active. 2019 was the worst year for hate killings since the FBI has been keeping data, and certainly the worst for DT killings, non-foreign influence, since '95. And what we're seeing is a diverse mix of folks. What just came out this morning? More attacks by ISIS overseas. So don't keep your eyes on only one entity. Who else? The folks on the hard militant left who want to disrupt certain types of infrastructure. But what I wanted to start with, before going into my whole spiel about what's going on with the chronology of extremism, was to talk about a couple of real examples. There was a former National Guardsman who was in a group called Atomwaffen that wanted to attack a Florida nuclear plant just in the last few years. Moreover, even before that, in 1985, over 300 law enforcement agents led by FBI went to Arkansas, where they broke up the Covenant Sword and Arm of the Law, a group that was founded in 1971 and is a white supremacist group. What were among the things that they found on this April 21st, 1985 raid? Potassium cyanide, because there was a plot to poison the municipal water supplies of several large cities. So if you don't think that these folks are relevant to you, I'm sorry. And what else have we seen? We've seen on the left, hard left, folks who have targeted infrastructure, including things like pipelines and stuff like that. We've seen animal liberation people, earth liberation people commit a variety of attacks involving buildings, infrastructure, labs, etc. So it's something that's all within the purview of the districts that you all manage. We've also seen, by the way, back in 1995, actual attempts at train derailments by some groups in the Southwest. So this is something that we've seen for some time. But let's look at the emerging picture. And one of the things that I like to look at are homicides. The folks in this represents the number of fatalities done by the color, and the color is attached to the ideology of the assailant. But it's much easier to look at visually. So the dark characters on there represent violent Salafist jihadists. And as we can see back earlier in 2016, they led extremist homicides in the United States. It's just a rough barometer. But look what happened. Next year went down. And what's been happening with the red folks? The red folks are white supremacists / far right. And they have been increasingly responsible for extremist homicides in the United States. And they have been the number one set of assailants with regard to the most lethal attacks since 2018. And now 2020, pandemic related, we saw something really interesting. We don't know exactly what's going on with hate crime. In New York City and Washington, D.C., they're down. In L.A., they're up. But anti-Asian is up. Why do I say that? Because if in the mind of somebody, anti-Asian, they might connect it to technology and try to hit infrastructure. What else? Medical establishments, things like. Remember, the people who do this sometimes have a rigidly sealed kind of organized list of targets and bigotry, whereas others, it's more elastic, right? So look what we saw on Christmas Day. But what I want to go to is some of the things relating to timing and how politics, and moreover, how the socio-political subculture identifies not only places for attack, right? Like, so QAnon is now saying that on March 4th, President Trump will be inaugurated. So guess what? The National Guard is staying on in DC after that date, and rightly so. So look at this. I'm going to show you something really interesting. We disaggregated Errol's FBI data for almost 30 years, and we put it on a heat map, and look what we found. In 2008, when President Obama was running for office, hate crimes peaked in October before he won the election. They rose in advance. And what else did we see? If you go back to May, the only other time that we had over 700 that year, and we rarely see 700 in the last decade or so, was when it looked like he was about to get the nomination. So when we see, for instance, red to blue flips, the increases come in advance. And interestingly enough, Dr. Southers wore many hats, and he told me at another presentation we were at that threats against candidate Obama were almost 4 times what we were seeing for President Bush. Let's look at another time. November 2016. That was the worst month for hate crime, going all the way back to September 2002, which was the first anniversary of 9/11. What was the second worst month of the decade? Charlottesville month. I'm sorry. Second worst month was midterm election month. And what do we see around these things? Let's go back. Not only did we see an increase in hate crimes that month, but the worst day for hate crime was the day after election. And tied into that was a plot to blow up a predominantly Muslim populated apartment complex in Garden City, Kansas. Similarly, if we look at the conflictual midterm, Tree of Life massacre came just 5 days before. And of course, the third worst month was around Charlottesville. And let me show you something around that about how you can have a catalytic event, but the socio-political speech around it can also influence things. Look at this. We did day-by-day ticks. We took the FBI data, took all those Legos and organized them. This is with respect to the election. You can see that. I had another chart, and what it showed was hate crimes around Charlottesville month did not peak on the day of or the day after the Charlottesville debacle. It peaked on the 6 days of and after President Trump's very fine people statement. So what I'm saying to you is when we're looking at intel, you not only have to look at catalytic events, but the rhetoric around it. And in the world of extremists, they'll blame things on folks that you wouldn't have imagined. The Tree of Life massacre, why did that fellow hit a synagogue? Because he believed that these caravans of Latinos were being coordinated and politically made possible by Jews. Same token, we've been seeing threats against public officials, and in particular, public health officials. Talking about school stuff, listen to this. And you haven't seen this reported widely. The Boogaloo boy who murdered 2 law enforcement officers around the time of the George Floyd protests, and people were trying to put that on BLM. He was a Boogaloo boy, and not only did he kill law enforcement, but he also had a plot to kidnap the children of school officials. So what I'm saying to you is, in this anti-elitist world that we're in, and if I showed you, because I didn't want to just line up a ton of PowerPoints, if you look at the chart of trust in institutions, communal institutions that hold us together, academia, the police, Congress, the Supreme Court, the media, medicine, all declined in recent decades. So, for instance, today we're seeing just the other week, the vaccination facility at Dodger Stadium targeted, albeit by peaceful yet somewhat disruptive protests. That's something that we have to constantly keep our eye on. And infrastructure has always been something that has been a popular target. The only thing is, we generally see the more serious folks actually get more operationalized to do it. So what I would say is, if you have sensitive infrastructure, and even if you think it's tangentially related to extremism, realign your security plan. Last spring, there was an attempt to ram a train into a medical facility in LA area. It wasn't successful, obviously, but it caused significant damage. So what I'm saying to you is, today, at a time when 11% of the population says violence is appropriate to resolve political disputes, and we're seeing conspiracy theories talk about everything from vaccinations to microchips to 5G to electrical facilities, and we have a folklore of leaderless resistance within the hard right, which says targeted attacks on both leaders, symbolic leaders, institutions, and infrastructure. It's part of the narrative and folklore of how these people operate. So, and they're particularly emboldened because the Capitol has been attacked. Look, I don't want to take any more time, but I'm happy to take questions. And again, I want to thank Dr. Southers and USC for kindly inviting me to this important presentation today. Thank you so much.
Ryan, you're always incredibly enlightening. And I know we have at least one raised hand, but I did want to, if I could, just take a moment or two to also share why we're here. COVID-19, as you've talked about, has been an incredible opportunity for the extremist groups that you described to recruit and radicalize. I mean, Brian and I, for those of you who don't know, we work in a world of homegrown violent extremism. And there's three areas that we look at. We look at extremists driven by race, we look at extremists driven by religion, and then a third group that we call issue-oriented extremists, anti-government, anti-Muslim, anti-abortion, et cetera. But what COVID brought to us in the stay-at-home orders was a, if you will, extremism trifecta of race, religion, and issue-oriented groups all coalescing under this umbrella of we now have government overreach. They're making us stay at home. They're making me wear a mask. I can't go to the gym. I can't watch any sports. And so what happened then, in addition to that, was that some of these more extreme ideologies, white supremacists and neo-Nazis specifically, were suggesting spread COVID to law enforcement, spread COVID to the Jewish community. We had an incredible uptick, as Brian mentioned, in hate crimes against Asian Americans, which is finally now getting some media attention after several deaths in the last 2 weeks. By the way, the presentations that our center puts on at USC in the last year before COVID hit, we had more requests for educational sessions on how to protect houses of worship than anything else. We spent more time in synagogues and churches than any place else this past year. So all topped off by the Capitol protests and the plots to include kidnapping and putting on trial governors of 2 states. So that's where we are. So I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to kind of lead up to how this era of COVID has actually facilitated not just the extremist movement, which is always concerning, but and now the extremist movement has targeted critical infrastructure in the way of government buildings, power plants, et cetera. We have an incredible challenge on our hand, exacerbated by the fact that many of these folks are embracing a hybrid of ideologies. It's almost like going to a restaurant and having a menu and checking off the things you like. There's nothing monolithic about it. It's very challenging, and I'm happy to entertain questions along with my esteemed colleague, Brian Levin. And Frank, the floor is yours.
Could I just agree with Errol as well? This happens all the time. One of the interesting things, and he hit such an important point, is how extremism has been mainstreamed. And let me just briefly give you a quick example. April 17th last year, we put out a threat advisory. We saw the president on Twitter, and he had tens upon tens of millions of followers at that time. Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and he made derogatory statements about the governor. What we saw was some paid Facebook groups that were paid by political folks, and they went in, we stopped counting them when they went into the hundreds. A friend of mine named Devin Burkhardt found that there were just under 3 million people. And what happened was you had folks that were outdoor enthusiasts or small business owners with understandable gripes and questions and a need for explanation with regard to these restrictions. But you also had anti-vaxxers, Second Amendment insurrectionists, and what you had was this expandable reservoir of grievance online, unfettered on social media, that had a transmitter in the president. And what we had was this elastic pool where these folks got together and mutated to the lowest common denominator of fear and paranoia, and indeed acceptance of insurrectionism, whether it was about the Second Amendment or the COVID restrictions, exactly as Dr. Southers said. On that note, I'm going to shut up and let us take some questions.
Frank, if I may, the last thing I'll say is this. I want to make sure people are aware of the protective security advisors that the Homeland Security Department has. We have more, obviously, in California than any other state. They are professionals. I'm really delighted that one of the best ones in the country, in fact, the PSA of the year, is one of our instructors, along with Dr. Zerunyan, in our program. His area of expertise, by the way, are drones and how they're being used to protect Please do not hesitate to reach out to the PSAs. Those are vulnerability assessments that you and your districts can get at no cost. It's your tax dollars at work. And they will work with you on vulnerability assessments. They'll work with you on countermeasures. They'll work with you on mitigating some of the issues that you'll have to address in protecting your districts and some of these sectors that I showed you in the beginning of this conversation.
Thank you both. If I may, we have an audience of special districts, and I want to kind of tie in both of your presentations to what we experience at the local level as a mayor and council member. I appreciate some of the data that you provide. Unfortunately, violence knows no politics. And it can occur on whatever political level it may be. I think our audience, the way I tie some of the data, Professor Levin, that you collected, for example, which is very interesting, is potentially to know when to protect those assets. It looks like the data you provide provides some sort of an analysis of what our emergency plans might take into account on dates, on various events, that we may become more vulnerable at the local level, no matter who on the political spectrum may wish to cause to violate, so to speak, infrastructure. To me, that's the most important tie that your research, as well as what Errol was presenting, is very interesting to special districts. And maybe we didn't have, and I can tell you for certainty that we didn't even think about at the local level to worry about in our emergency plans potential violence on the basis of symbolic dates or things happening, various events happening. So that I think is very, very helpful. Feel free to comment, Errol or Levin, based on Professor Levin, based on what I said, because I think our audience is interested in hearing what you have to say as to what they need to put in their emergency plans or how they need to address their emergency plan in terms of preparation, because we've been talking about preparation and the importance of preparation, and what you seem to present can go or should go into the preparation.
Let me give you two things and then I'll pivot to Brian. I'm answering one of the questions that was in the chat. The most significant threat you have is the insiders that work there. And we often forget that. They have more knowledge, they have more capacity, they have more experience, they know the lay of the land. So I know I'm speaking to the choir, but the proper vetting and re-vetting of your personnel cannot be overstated. If you ever have an issue, that's going to be your challenge. And I know, again, I'm preaching to the choir. When you decide to release someone and have them separate from your company is when you really need to make sure you know who's leaving and where they're going and what capacity they have. The second thing I'll mention, someone asked in the chat, protective security advisors, PSAs, are with DHS. Again, they are at no cost. It's your tax dollars at work. If you'll just Google them, you'll find them. It is really important to have that assessment done before you decide to develop a plan. And as I mentioned previously, the plan has got to be dynamic. As Brian will tell you, today's threat is not tomorrow's threat, because as you mitigate and put in countermeasures for today, they've already thought about next week. And so you're always going to be behind them when you put these plans together. I have my own personal opinions about red teaming and tabletops, because I've never been to a tabletop where the people putting it on weren't successful. And then it seems like whenever we have a disaster, we didn't think about that. So I have my own personal opinions about tabletops and red teaming. Although effective, they are limited in scope and reality, because we typically, as Richard Clark said before 9/11, we suffered from a failure of imagination. And I often remember that. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. Another reason why I love doing these things with Errol. Not only was I going to talk about insiders, which he already did so nicely, but also look for outsiders at particular times. Give you an example. Back in 2003, there was the most expensive arson in the eco-terror area to date, done in San Diego. And this is why it's good to be connected to the fusion centers, to be connected to the JRICs and the JTTFs. What was happening in San Diego that day? Well, a notorious eco-assailant, if you will, was doing a talk on how to do arsons for young people around a college. And literally that day or the day after, the arson took place. So if there's something going on in your community, the Capitol attack, right? Those people didn't come just out of nothing. There was already some kind of organized event. So if you're seeing some kind of protest with regard to whatever it is that you do, make sure that you look at that. Also, again, boy, I love doing these things with Errol. He talks about imagination. Look, cyber. We don't need that much imagination. Look what happened in Florida just a few weeks ago with regard to the water facility on the west coast of the state there. That was where there was really no security for their computer system. And the other thing that was touched on before, look at drones. Because drones can be used for a variety of things, including reconnoitering. And again, getting back to things, a lot of times if you just put a little fence, it's better than no fence. You know, I was just teaching my class today on assassinations. And when Lincoln was assassinated, there was one police officer from Washington PD assigned to him, and he took the time off to watch the play and grab a drink. So you want to always reassess. And also you have to be aware, not just of abstract threats, but where is your particular industry or infrastructure highlighted by extremists? Water supplies, electrical plants, what else? We have community college districts. I was just at the hearing for Enrique Marquez back in the fall. He had wanted to hit the 91 freeway, but he also wanted to hit Riverside Community College. So what I'm saying to you is you have both infrastructure where people gather, like amusement parks, but you also have infrastructure where people don't gather, but they're identified as some kind of villain, like the 5G towers. In England, they've been having a real problem with attacks against those. And look what happened, as we saw in Nashville on Christmas Day. So what I think is important is don't sit back on your laurels. If you have either people in your institution or others outside, for instance, like fusion centers, that you can say, hey, can you just, keep us on track if there's anything that blips up relating to our industry? It doesn't have to be information about an actual coordinated and directed attack, even if your particular entity is the target of some kind of broad discussion, right? Vaccination facilities now, for instance, we're hearing a lot of that. Make sure that you have some kind of adaptable plan, because you don't have to necessarily get information about a specifically planned attack if there is already some kind of chatter on the internet that puts your particular entity, not necessarily specifically your location in Lake Charles or something, but just generally be on the lookout.
Errol, in the chat, there is a question that you might be able to answer as a former FBI. Are you familiar with an FBI InfraGuard program? Would you recommend municipalities participate in this program? InfraGuard is a partnership between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and members of the private sector for the protection of U.S. critical infrastructure. Through seamless collaboration, InfraGuard connects owners and operators, etc. FBI provide education, information sharing, networking on emerging technologies and threats.
So Brian knows why I'm smiling, because Frank, that incredible description you just gave describes the program exactly. I am very familiar with InfraGard. So for those of you who are out there taking advantage of it, thank you for your participation and volunteering to participate in that. It is a network. And again, as Brian mentioned, much of these threats we're dealing with are networked. I know you always hear about the quote unquote lone wolf, but most of these threats are networked. We have to have the same kinds of networks. Brian knows my background. I've been teaching in Israel for 15 years, and my mentor over there is Dr. Boaz Ganor, and his favorite saying is, we need a network to defeat a network. And that's very, very true. So InfraGard will give you information to, I'll say, dangerously close to classified information as it relates to infrastructure in your areas. The other thing I will share with you, going back to my conversation about houses of worship, subscribe to everything you can that's free that comes out every single day with regards to public source information. I subscribe to something called the Secure Community Network, SCN. And I say that with you because although I speak to an interfaith community, I speak to a lot of Jewish organizations, and that particular Secure Community Network focuses on anti-Semitism, not just domestically, but globally. So unfortunately, I say it that way because it's true. Unfortunately, every single morning, I get a SCN bulletin of what's happened in the United States, what's happened abroad as it relates to acts of hate and violence against Jews. That is very important because sometimes it happens in our own backyard and we don't know. I'm also saying it because, as I mentioned previously, this tremendous uptick in assaults against Asians in relation to COVID-19 is something we really need to pay attention to. So back to my point, InfraGard is wonderful. Thank you for participating in it. It's a great way to learn more about the Bureau. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm doing my commercial right now. It's a great way to learn what they do and work with them, but also subscribe to as many platforms that offer, if not daily information that's public regarding threats and activities in the country and the world. Thank you, Frank.
And if I could just piggyback off that, take it ever as a chance. We not only use the assets of the FBI. I got in trouble one time. I was doing a talk before the FBI, and I said, I'm thrilled to be here speaking to the second best law enforcement agency in the world. And they said, no, the NYPD isn't first. And it went south from there. So I'm not going to put that joke in. But what I would like to say is, within your industry, coordinate, because sometimes it's there might be a water plant in Florida, sound familiar, that had some kind of event that you want to know about. And yes, it happened. So a lot of times there might be incursions into your industry that wouldn't have necessarily taken place in your geographic area. The other thing I would say is if there is interesting kind of protests or conflicts within your area, and even if it has a tangential relationship, be aware. The last thing I would say is sometimes extremists want to target infrastructure not because they hate that particular target, but because one of the things that a lot of these folks are looking at, the accelerationists, for instance, who just want to burn society down, is they want to cause some kind of disruption. So while they're at one end of town, they can burn down something else. So if they can shut out all the lights, they can then do something else. So I would look at that. And lastly, I want to just say, remember who are the people that do symbolic attacks. Okay, there are three types. One is the ideologically motivated, primarily, could be political, religious, or both. Number two, the psychologically dangerous. They could be cognitively impaired. They could be unstable. They could think that there's rays coming in from the water plant. There's rays coming in from the microwave towers. You get the idea. And then you have personal benefit or revenge. Joe Stack flew his plane into the IRS building in Texas many years ago after he got audited, but he was ideologically an anti-tax person as well. So there's a variety of folks. Not all of them are with necessarily broad terror groups, nor are all of them even associated with a particular ideology necessarily. Sometimes it's psychological instability or some kind of revenge. Remember actually, most people won't. The Mad Bomber went after Con Ed in New York in the 40s and 50s, and he would sign the letters FP, fair play, because he had some kind of personal vendetta against the electric company. So look also for a combination of not only ideological, but also idiosyncratic motives, as well as motives to disrupt either society or that town so that they can do another attack somewhere else.
Professors Southers and Levin, I think what you've done today very successfully is to put on our radar screen, both at the special districts or local government, municipal governments, a very important topic that frankly, most of the time is missed. In our emergency plans, we always look at the obvious, so to speak, right? Whether it's extreme weather, whether it's the collaboration between organizations and EOCs, etc. And of course, we do look at threats as well, security threats, but never in the perhaps in the context that you've described when they occur. And how they occur. And they don't have to be direct threats. They could be indirect threats, is what I'm learning from you. And I'm kind of regurgitating this information so that, everybody is on the same page. And to the extent there are any questions, that the questions could be asked. But with that, are there, and I'm getting to one question in setting it up perhaps, but are there any best practices how districts can review and watch out for these threats? You mentioned some of them belonging to various publications and organizations, et cetera, and in fact, paying attention to direct and indirect, et cetera. Is there any other best practices that you can mention for our audience to kind of learn from and go back and look at their plans and to see if they could be implemented?
Well, Frank, I'm going to push that response or to that question to the Department of Homeland Security's Protective Security Advisors. And here's why. Those are the people in your respective backyards that are doing assessments in districts across the county, the region, and the state. There's two advantages to that. Number one, they're going to know the threats proximate to you, and they're going to be best educated on any best practices, not just here in California, but nationally. So I would suggest we get you to talk to them for those two reasons, because they're going to be able to say, here's what's happening down the road that you may not be aware of. However, here's what we're doing in New Jersey. That's a best practice that we might be able to apply here. They're incredibly expert. They're very professional. They're cutting edge. And I think it's a resource that should be taken advantage of, especially at no cost.
Professor Levin, anything to add?
Yeah, what I would do, and again, tinker never has a chance. Perimeter protection, right? Aerial protection, right? Right now with drone, every other person has a drone except for me. Cyber incursions, really important. And the other thing, intel. And what I mean is not your intel, their intel. Back when I was at Southern Poverty Law Center in another century, I'm not that young, unfortunately. One of the things that we found that the militia groups had were these military salute forms, surveillance forms to look at various targets. And that included things like infrastructure. So if you have some kind of suspicious activity, someone's kind of hanging out around there, or there's been some minor threats, a lot of times these people will try and test the security beforehand. So there might be some minor things that you'll just throw away. So what I would say is make sure, remember that chain, everyone that works at your location and in your area. Is there someone who's showing up a lot and doesn't appear to have any business? Are there unusual calls being made seeking information? And the last thing I would say is, do everything that Errol said, but make sure that with your local police, that they have an idea of what the emergency contacts are. Maybe there's blueprints of your area that they can have in case there's some kind of event there. Because what you want to make sure that you do is you have a plan in place and coordination in place beforehand, even if you think the risk is relatively low. So any kind of coordination that you can have with your local police department is really critical, as well as, I think, not only what Errol was talking about, but if there are resources that you can get or coordination with the governor's OES as well.
Well, I want to thank you both. I know Senator Stern is on deck for 11:45. I want to be respectful of his time and yours. If there is we have about a minute or so. If there is any last minute thing that you wanted to add, this is the time.
Can I just say something real briefly? 2020 was a crazy year of realignment. And I think it's going to be very interesting once the public gathering restrictions end. People are going to be a lot more mobile, and they're not just going to be assembling online, they're going to be assembling together. And when they assemble together, that's a lot of times when you get these plots. Really interesting. Just today, right before I got on with you, got a call from a reporter, a couple more Oath Keepers involved in coordinated planning, apparently, with regard to the Capitol. So just keep working on your game. And also what I would do is just close with my statement with what Dr. Errol said, be imaginative. Think of, if you were a bad guy, what are the Achilles heels that exist at your location and within your particular entity?
Right. Well said. And Frank, I'll be very brief and just say, first of all, thank you for doing this. It's these kinds of forums that helps educate, make people more aware of these things. The most common complaint that I hear from someone is, I never knew this. So thank you for doing this. This is what's going to make us safer. The threat doesn't live in a bubble, and neither do we. And we have to share information and learn what's going on so we can address it. Thank you for this forum, and thank you for allowing us to contribute.
Well, we appreciate your participation very much. You know, we at USC Price certainly are to us, what is most important is our academic abilities and also our research, and both of you contribute to that in great ways. And of course, all three of us are implementers and people that care really about the practice and the implementation. And folks who are on the line with us, over 140 people or so that are listening to this, are implementers day in and day out. They're in the front lines, and whatever we can do on the academic circles to help that process and put it on the radar screen at a minimum, which you have very ably done, is truly appreciated. So thank you both. We'll adjourn this session.
Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome Senator Henry Stern, representing the 27th Senate District. More importantly, a very important city in California residing in his district. Everyone knows of Malibu, this great California city, and he represents a couple of very good friends of mine. Mayor Mikey Pearson, of course, and Karen Fair are both dear friends of mine in our local government circles. And of course, formerly Lou Lamont from the great city of Malibu, where Senator Stern is from as well. So, Senator, I am going to turn to you. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you for being here. Your bio is already in our materials. I am not going to read your extensive bio.
Spare them.
You are also a fellow lawyer, trained lawyer. So the floor is yours, sir.
I won't lawyer it too much today, though. I assume that's why you didn't bring me on for to get too deep into, CEQA litigation and OPR technical guidance documents and hazard mitigation planning. And, I do, in this public service job, I do like to stay in the details because the details matter. But the people who actually make it work is everybody at this summit here today. Just looking through the list of everyone who spoke, I think I've been on the phone with half of them, frankly, who preceded me, trying to figure out how to empower this incredibly diverse and nimble community of emergency managers and special districts and first responders and local government leaders to really figure out how to get you all the resources and the tools you need to respond on the ground to emergencies of all kinds. I think you just finished a panel on the state of extremism and the uptick in hate crimes. I've been through enough in this district in the few years I've been in office to get a taste of what exactly the job of disaster and emergency management entails. Going through a mass shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill, literally on the eve of the Woolsey fire breaking out and burning down the town I grew up in and the place I was living in. So going through crises and sort of suffering pain at a large scale has been a great educator for me as somebody who grew up around disaster as a kid in Malibu, right? It was like there's mudslide day, there's, is it earthquake day, mudslide day, fire day? I think there's a strange correlation between some of our most beautiful places and some of our most dangerous places. And that conversation about how risk gets embedded into, where people live and how people live is evolving right now in insurance and land use and all kinds of other arenas. But I guess I want to talk about the other side of Malibu and the other side of disaster today. I was really struck by the FEMA report that just came out, and I just took over the legislature's Joint Emergency Management Committee as the chair there. I also chair the Resources Committee, so I've been looking at wildfire for years, but now we're sort of trying to look at emergencies writ large and figure out how to get our heads around it. And I think one of the gaps politically that we're facing right now is, disasters are very human when they happen. We know about the people in Texas hurting right now. We know about people who are suffering who are victims of a shooting at a local place of worship, or we know people who, when their houses burn down, but we don't think of risk mitigation in human enough terms. And I don't think we've put an equity lens on the emergency risk arena in the way it deserves. When you look at that FEMA vulnerability analysis, or you look at other maps that our friend at USC, Dr. Pastor, has put together in mapping the most polluted communities, or even the equity metrics USC, by the way, has been developing on public health. The overlay between where the most polluted communities are and most vulnerable to climate change, where the communities that are getting hit hardest by this pandemic, where the communities are that are most vulnerable to other disasters, the overlay is there. It's the same people hurting right now who are working people, low income, tend to be more people of color, and communities that are in industrial areas. Those are the places that are at risk. It happens both in wildfire when, the folks in a trailer park in Seminole Springs, not in a mansion in Malibu, but in the trailer park there, lose absolutely everything and have no recourse. And that's their last penny, and they're on fixed income and they're done. We can't get those people back on track. To, the people living in Whittier Narrows and down in South LA below the dams that we hope hold, but we're looking at flood events and we're saying to ourselves, a lot of people could get hurt. You're out in Pacoima and looking at extreme heat events, or along the ridges of the San Gabriel Valley where Bobcat just burned through. This cannot be a wonky sort of numbers game. And B, this cannot be something precious for the wealthy to worry about. Disaster is an equity issue. There is underlying structural and systemic both racism and classism that expose the most vulnerable to these risks. And so when I have to go out, and I really need CSDA and everyone on this call's help, frankly, engaging with your local legislators and with the people who work for you to motivate us this year to say part of this economic recovery, part of the pivot out of this pandemic has got to be a whole new look at resilience in our communities and in our infrastructure. And we want to make that push with the federal government, and we want to meet that with a state resiliency bond, which failed in the last session, a $5.5 billion bond that I want bigger, because when you look at the quantified risk, it's not in the B's, it's in the T's. And so that sort of disproportionate risk sitting out on the horizon for us, I don't think my colleagues have had enough. When you've been through it, and then you're attuned, but until it hits you and you have to actually go stand in a high school gym with 1,000 people who don't know if they just lost their home and are crying and sobbing and don't know what to do, like until that moment, you don't realize that this is job number one for us as state leaders. So I'd like to see the state make some transformative investment. Could help you use your help there. We're talking about moving a $500 million early action investment in March, as soon as March. The governor put a $363 million proposal on the table. We want to go bigger than that in the Senate. We think we can do more, and we think we can go wildfire, but also beyond. And, building permanent capacity. This is the last sort of point I wanted to make, and this is a wonkier one. Not about the equity driver, but about the way government money moves. Our thesis right now is that we need to change it from a grant-driven mindset where you all have to go chase, whatever program it is, and maybe, put a report together analyzing risk or do a mapping project, all important things, hire a consulting firm, all good. But I want to build in-house institutionalized capacity around resiliency within our local emergency services operations so that you have full-time employees who don't just have to figure out, okay, FEMA's coming to town with a vaccine tent and I got to do that today, or, oh, there's a fire over here, I got to do that, and not just have to be reactive, but so you have planning and community capacity building within sort of county and local government operations. So it's an area that I'm obviously passionate about, we use your help going forward. But please do lean on me and know that this is my central focus in the legislature this year. And I think it can be more people's. We just go do that extra work on top of all the important work you do to have a conversation with the people who work for you and educate your members. And we will, we'll do the rest. But we need your help to refine all this and really reawaken people to the opportunity for both justice of some sort, to protect the most vulnerable, and to actually pull ourselves out of this recovery and do it resiliently. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much for taking the time from your busy schedule, especially nowadays, to come and to speak to us, to our constituency. This is very, very important. So on behalf of the California Special District Association, as well as USC Southern Price School of Public Policy, thank you very much for your time. We are going to adjourn to a short break now until about 12:05, when we will welcome our last speaker. Thank you again, Senator.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time. And I'll say hi to Malibu for you.
Sorry, Ivan, we put you before everyone's hunger. So, but regardless, we're looking forward to hearing from you about navigating assets pre and post disaster, which is the subject matter of the last conversation during this summit until next week. So, Ivan Mcgowan is the Associate Director of Finance and Administration, CEO, Office of Emergency Management, the County of Los Angeles. Ivan, your bio is in the materials already, so I'm not going to go into it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, USC, CSDA, and Edison for hosting the event. I will try to be as fast as I can. Everyone's hungry, like what the doctor said. I do apologize in advance. Some of the discussion that we're going to be talking about is very technical, and we usually dedicate a couple of days for each topic. Like for instance, the FEMA grants portal, we usually dedicate a couple of days for that, for training, just for information and to go through the system. But I'll try my best to give you guys a brief overview, to give you some, a little bit of information as you move forward with recovery in our disaster emergency events. So again, like the doctor mentioned, my name is Ivan Masayan. I'm the Associate Director for LA County's CEO, OEM, Office of Emergency Management. Today, we'll be discussing public assistance process, and FEMA has a bunch of programs. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to be talking about the biggest grant program that FEMA has, which is public assistance, or PA. We're going to be talking about program guidelines. What are the eligibility? What are the requirements? We're also going to be talking about FEMA grants portal, the new web-based portal that FEMA has, where you manage your grants, you manage your projects, your disaster recovery projects. We're also going to be talking about a little bit of audit tips, what you guys need to know in terms of managing your projects, making sure you're in compliance with the uniform guidance, in case you get audited by the OIG. What are those different strategies and tips and points that you have to remember in terms of audit? And then lastly, we're going to be talking about pre and post disaster checklist, what you need to know before disaster and after a disaster. So with that, as you may know, and our director was speaking earlier, Director Mcgowan, LA County is diverse, and I understand this is for all special districts within California. But from our perspective, from LA County, we are the diverse operational area. Unfortunately, we took the #1 spot this year as the riskiest county in our nation. So as you can see here in our picture, we have the fire, which I believe that's the Woolsey fire. We have the pandemic, COVID-19. We've had storms, we've had civil unrest, we've had earthquakes. So you name it, LA County has experienced. And unfortunately, we've experienced a majority of this, just in the last couple of months. And so it's really important how we strategize and plan in dealing with emergencies and how we could recover from them. So with the public assistance program, like I said, it's FEMA's largest grant program. It provides funding to public entities. So I'm going to start from the very bottom. The eligible entities will be your counties, the cities, the special districts, school districts, colleges, private nonprofits, and tribal governments. It's not a program that will pay for everything. The program is designed to pay part of your eligible costs following a presidential and/or a governor-declared disaster. And like I mentioned, it's not going to pay for everything. The objective is to restore your assets to a pre-disaster condition. So if you lost probably an Ford F-150, they're not going to replace that with something more expensive. It's going to be a like-for-like replacement or reimbursement, assuming that asset is a part of an eligible emergency protection activity that you guys were doing in terms of responding and recovering from disaster. And like I said, it's a reimbursement program. So all the eligible entities have to incur the cost and apply for reimbursement and seek reimbursement. It's not the other way around where they front fund you. Although in some cases, like for different events, like for the COVID-19, FEMA will allow to apply for expedited funding. It's at the federal level, it's enabled by the Stafford Act, and at the state level, it's enabled by the California Disaster Assistance Act. There will be disasters where the federal government will not participate, or there will be no presidential declaration, and the state may opt into just participating by themselves. So in that case, the state becomes the grantor, and the entities, the local government entities become directly grantees. But if in this chart, the federal government participated, we have a presidential declaration. FEMA, the federal government, becomes the grantor. Cal OES, or the state, becomes the grantee, and the local government becomes the sub-grantee. So what are the costs that they will pay for under the public assistance program? Like I mentioned, they don't pay for everything. So there are different buckets of costs based on the program. And they divide it into two major areas: emergency work and permanent work. Under emergency work, and statutorily, you're required to complete the work within 6 months, subject to time extensions, is Category A, debris removal, and Category B, emergency protective measures. Category B could be like your kitchen sink of costs and activities, because it captures a lot. So to give you an example, valid or eligible emergency protective measures could be sheltering. If you have storms or tsunamis, sandbagging, obviously evacuation, and the like. With the COVID-19, we have vaccination efforts. Those could fall under Category B, emergency protective measures. For permanent work, you're required to complete the work within 18 months, and then subject also to time extensions based on extenuating circumstances. Category C would be your roads and bridges. Water control facilities will be D. E will be your buildings, if you have any damages to your buildings and equipment. F will be your utilities, and G will be your parks, recreational facilities, and other facilities. In every disaster event, these are not automatic. So to give you an example, for under COVID-19 major disaster, the president only declared Category B. So we don't have any debris removal, we don't have any of the permanent work. So depending on the event, and so they will let us know. The federal government will identify which eligible categories of costs are eligible for you to seek reimbursement. Now, the cost share formula is typically the federal government cost share 75% as stipulated in the Stafford Act. And then the other 25% is really the local share. Now, the state could cost share on the 25%, and it's not automatic. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So if they do cost share, they cost share 75% of the 25%, effectively making their share at 18.75%. And if that's the case, the local share becomes 6.25%. Now, the FEMA and the state share changes and it varies. So let me give you an example. Under the COVID-19 major disaster event, when under the previous administration, President Trump, when he declared that disaster, the federal cost share was stipulated at 75%. But fast forward this year, under President Biden, he changed that federal cost share from 75% to 100%. So which means under the COVID-19 major disaster declaration, the federal cost share now is 100%. So there will be no state share or local share. The thresholds are for a small project are from $3,000 to $132,000. So what that means is that under $3,000, FEMA will not write a project. If your costs are under $3,000, they will not write that project. And then anything above $132,000 is classified as a large project. The difference between small and large projects is that a large project is paid at actual costs, and really there's technically no cap on that. Whether versus your small project, you are capped at whatever the threshold is for that year. For this year, it's $132,000. For California, there's also thresholds that you have to remember. For California, it's $1.55 per capita. So what this means is that if we get a disaster, they will look into, before the federal government participates, what is the actual cost that you've incurred, and multiply that per your per capita, which is your population. So it's about $62 million. And for LA County, it's about $38 million. So as you can see, it's a pretty high number before we actually get a disaster assistance from federal government. Of course, the federal government does not just use the per capita indicator in providing disaster assistance, but these are some of the standards that they use when they're deliberating and determining whether there will be a presidential declaration. This is a chart of the public assistance process. So usually when we have a disaster, we have a local proclamation, which is done by your local government, or in this case, under the COVID-19, your public health official. Usually what that triggers is emergency powers, and that proclamation from your local government entity or your public health official will signify the local government or the district's ability to recover from that disaster. And that's a prerequisite in order to get state and federal assistance. After that, the county's operational area, depending on where your special district is located. So if you're within the county, LA County OEM is the operational area coordinator. All the special districts, school districts, cities, all 88 cities of the county, they will report their damages to us, to my team, and we will compile those costs and see where we're at in terms of threshold, in terms of magnitude and severity of damage. When we get those IDEs, or initial damage estimates, we submit that to the state, and the state will look into that, and they will schedule PDA, or preliminary damage assessment visits. That's when FEMA teams and Cal OES teams, state teams, fly in and look into, do a visual inspection and verify the damages caused by the disaster emergency event. At which point they will compile those findings. They will do calculations, measurements, and provide information to the governor, for the governor to determine if he or she will, in this case, he will seek presidential assistance through a presidential declaration. Afterwards, if we have a presidential declaration, we will have an applicant's briefing, which the county operational area will be hosting, and will be inviting all of the co-hosting. The county will be co-hosting with the state, and will invite all the jurisdictions within the operational area. So all the cities that were impacted, all the schools, the special districts, and then the grant management process, as you can see, is laid out there. You're going to be, all the eligible applicants will be given access to the portal, which we'll be talking about after this slide. And you will be applying through the portal. You will be managing your project through the portal. All the funding, the obligation, and the progress reports all the eligible applicants will be interfacing with the FEMA and the state program delivery managers. And the very last phase will be, final payments, appeals, or audits, and especially record retention for your projects. Now, for the audits, that could come at any point of this process. It could come right when you submit your projects. It could come at the later stage, and it could even come after you close out your projects. So the FEMA Grants Portal is, like I mentioned, is an online platform website that you use to formulate, track, and manage all your activities for your damage claims and projects. You will be given access to that portal, and usually through the applicant's briefing. FEMA representatives are there to guide you through creating your user profiles into the FEMA Grants Portal. You can update your profile there, assign roles. You can submit your official application to the public assistance grants through the portal, and then you upload your project documentation. You track your activities and the status of your projects. At the very bottom, I put there a link of YouTube training videos that you can watch to see how the portal works, and see how the different interfaces work. So this is the portal. This is the landing page where when you type in the HTML link, and then when you sign in, this is where you're going to do your username, your password. At the very bottom, you could see you could register your organization, or at the applicant's briefing, like I mentioned, FEMA representatives can walk you through the process. This is the entry page for my organization, LA County. It's going to be similar if you have access to the portal. This is what it looks like. You would see all the different navigation buttons there. You have the profile, your organization profile. You can assign personnel their roles and responsibilities. You can view each event that you are approved for, that you are an eligible applicant for. If you have a storm, a fire event, that will be shown there. And then you would see all the different elements here through the grant cycle process as you move through, as you move your projects from funding obligation to closeout. So these are just the list of information that is often requested by federal and state. So you can see they will look for a lot. From the initial damage estimates to the preliminary damage assessments, down to when they're writing your project, they will look for very specific information, your damage location, description, and dimension. They will look for your employees' timesheets, activity logs, purchase orders, invoices, payment vouchers, your maintenance records. They will look for photographs before and after of the completed work, drawings, sketches, copies of your applicable codes and standards for your jurisdiction, for the county or the city where you're located at, contractors, bids, solicitation documents. They will look for rental and lease agreements, and lastly, your cost estimates and methodology. So this is just a reminder of what are the eligibility requirements of the program. First, it has to be reasonable and necessary. It has to be the direct result of a disaster and located in the designated disaster area. So if the president and the governor proclaimed it within LA County, that asset cannot be within or outside of that disaster designated area. It has to be, the cost has to be a legal responsibility of the applicant. It has to be adequately documented and then authorized and permitted under federal, state, and local laws. And then anything that you do has to be consistent with your internal policies, regulations, and procedures, comply with the applicable federal procurement standards to CFR or Part 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations under the uniform guidance. And then lastly, it cannot duplicate funding from other federal agencies or insurance cover. It cannot be contingent upon state or federal funding. You cannot say that, okay, we're doing these activities or projects because we're going to get reimbursed by FEMA or state. It doesn't work that way. It's as if you have to be performing this work as if FEMA or the state is not in the picture, and you're doing eligible emergency work to save or protect life and property. So what are the common audit findings? Duplication of benefits, excessive charges, unrelated project charges, unapplied credits. One of the most common would be poor project accounting and contracting practices. Some of the the Code of Federal Regulations emphasizes the full and open competition and bidding with all procured services and contracts. There is a certain wiggle room there in terms of exigency period, but for the large part, the federal government emphasizes full and open competition with the your procuring practices. So this is just a checklist of what from my perspective, and there's several school of thoughts out there. And from my perspective, from my experience, I think these were the most relevant and really key for me in terms of what you need to do and remember before a disaster and after disaster. Number one is you have to have a recovery plan. You have to develop that recovery plan, pre-identify your funding, your loan, any contracting mechanisms, manpower, resources that you will be deploying. You have to have a good documentation and coding system so you can maximize federal and state reimbursement. You have to review your assets, consider upgrading, replacing, retrofitting infrastructure, and updating your obsolete practices or policies and procedures. You have to plan and exercise and continuously evaluate, your preparedness, your capabilities. The previous panelists have hammered and emphasized, capabilities and capacities. And then mitigation and insurance, a big part of that is really mitigation becomes your buffer zone to minimize or reduce your risk or your losses. And then post-disaster checklist, you can see, you notice I put in their recovery plan, because whatever you start with your recovery plan, you have to implement it. I've seen a lot of organizations spend lots of money developing a recovery plan, but they just thousands or hundreds of pages, and they just put it in one cabinet and never to be seen. So if you did your recovery plan, you spent money on that resources, exercise it, train to it, and implement it and execute it. So and that will be the main difference between a successful recovery versus not a successful recovery. Obviously, accounting and record retention, coordinating with other organizations, and political and community support is also a big factor. And lastly, having that mindset of this recovery could transition to a long-term recovery. We're at 1 year now with COVID-19, so we're going to have to adjust and adapt to the new normal in terms of recovery, long-term recovery. Okay, so with that, I guess we have a couple of minutes to go through some of the quizzes here. Pop quiz: repair work at the Dodger Stadium, can that be claimed by the county? False. No, it cannot be claimed by the county because, like we mentioned, it's not the legal responsibility of the county. It's not owned by the county, and it's not going to be an eligible asset. Debris removal is one of the cost categories. True. We discussed category A is debris removal, and it's one of the eligible costs that you could claim under the FEMA's public assistance program. Number 3, project status funding can be viewed in grants portal. True. We went through real quick what the grants portal looks like. You can see the personnel, the organization personnel profile, and your project status and funding can be viewed in the grants portal. Insurance proceeds need not be tracked or reported. That's false. We mentioned earlier that insurance, no duplication of benefits, whether it's coming from a federal agency or insurance proceeds. So you need to track those and declare those, because FEMA will deduct those from your final payments. Lastly, I can always sell sole source contracts during an emergency, and that's a false. Like I mentioned earlier, FEMA, the federal government, emphasizes full and open competition. Documentation can be destroyed immediately after a project is closed out. That's a false. We have strict record retention requirements. In fact, I failed to mention, once you close out all your projects, your last date of your project when you close out, you count 3 years from the last project closeout. That's when the audit waiver, they call it audit waiver from the state that you will receive from your last project closeout. You count 3 years from that date. That's when you can start destroying some of your records. Excessive or unrelated charges are common audit findings. That's true. The 2 types of PA work is emergency and permanent. That's true. Grants portal allows applicants to assign user roles. We discussed about that, the personal profiles. And lastly, the current threshold for LA County is $20 million, which is false. We discussed that it's about double that, 40 million. And with that, thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Zerunyan.
Thank you, Ivan. That was extremely informative. I'm a student for life. I love learning, and you were very, very thorough and very effective in your teaching. So thank you very much for that. There's a couple of questions before you go. One is, do you have any best practices for special districts as to how they can expeditiously do their cost recovery evaluation? And is there any training programs for that?
So I'll address the first part. Best practices, like I mentioned, it all starts on planning and before the event. So, I always like to think that recovery doesn't start from day zero when the disaster happens. Recovery starts prior to that, from preparedness, mitigation, and building capacities. So, what we did with the county, and I can share with the county, is that prior to a couple of our disasters, we didn't have really a solid, standard, unified way of tracking costs. So we developed a uniform way of creating task codes, project codes, major project codes, disaster codes that all of our 38 departments will use. And that pretty much gave us a blueprint and a guideline of how we will be tracking and coding our costs for these disasters. And then the second part of the question, are there trainings? Yes, there are trainings. The county's operational area, as the county operational area coordinator, we host a couple of trainings with all of our jurisdictions. In the past couple of trainings, we've invited FEMA lawyers to fly in to discuss the procurement guidelines, some of the FEMA guidelines. We also do these trainings after the disaster. Like I mentioned in the applicant's briefing, they will go through in extent and length of what the program is and what are those guidelines are.
And another question popped up. Are there any templates or resources that are available for development of recovery plans?
There are. If you could reach out to OEM, we could provide you some of those templates. We have. We could also provide you what the recovery plan for the county is. That's public document. And you can mirror your plan under the county. Obviously, if you're part of LA County, you're part of our recovery plan. But yeah, we have templates for that.
Well, Ivan, thank you very much. You've been extremely helpful. And this is, as I said, very impactful presentation as far as I'm concerned. I've learned a lot. Apparently, you know your subject matter very well, so that's a good thing. I'm happy that I live in the county of LA and that you're working in it. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
With that, I am going to thank everyone who participated this morning with us. I look forward to seeing you all next Friday. I want to thank, of course, the California Special District Association, Edison, as well as all of the policy-driven organizations that sponsor our Executive Education Forum at USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. And we've listed them all in the agenda that you have for the summit. Megan, thank you again. This was a very resourceful, impactful morning for someone like me who does not know much about the topic other than my function as a mayor and council member in a city that I interact with. And next week, we're going to have some of our staff members present actually a collaboration of preparing a plan for among cities and jurisdictions like special districts as well. We have, as I said, several of them on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. But thank you again for your partnership. Thank you again for allowing us to deliver this program. To the rest of you, enjoy your lunch. We are adjourned until next Friday. Look forward to seeing you then.